Welcome to another exciting Werewolf Shifter-rom-ance audiobook, a Luna M. Rose collection. Bound to the Merciless Alpha Lord. Chapter 1. The Mark of Fate. Lily stood on the ceremonial grounds, her heart a frantic drum against the cage of her ribs. The air in the great hall of the Silverwood Pack was thick with anticipation, a heavy blanket woven from the scents of old magic, expensive perfumes, and simmering ambition. The crowd was a sea of silks and velvets, a silent, judgmental audience waiting for the night's great spectacle to unfold. But Lily stood apart, a ghost in a borrowed dress, feeling the cold sweat form on the back of her neck. She glanced at her benefactor, Lord Bennet, standing near the front with his family. His expression was stern and impassive, though his eyes held a glint of something sharp and calculating. Her stomach twisted into a painful knot. She had been prepared for this night, the annual choosing, her entire life, drilled on the importance of being invisible, of being silent, of being nothing. But now that the moment had arrived, she wasn't sure if she was ready to accept the quiet oblivion that was her destiny. Lord Bennet's voice echoed in her memory from that very morning. "This is your place, Lily. You will not fight it. You will be grateful." Her hands trembled, and she clenched them into fists at her sides, fighting to stay composed. She had been told all her life that this was her lot, an Omega orphan, a nobody. The reality of it, of her future being a void while others were handed kingdoms, was a bitter pill to swallow. The elder raised the orb of Selene into the air. The milky white sphere hummed with magic, its light glowing brighter, pulsing with a soft, ethereal rhythm. Lily felt the pull of it, the magic in the air thickening until it was a palpable force. She could feel the power in the ground beneath her feet, in the air she breathed. Her skin prickled with the weight of the moment. One by one, the unmated alphas from the allied territories were called forward. The orb would cast a beam of silver light, connecting an alpha to his chosen mate. A gasp from the crowd, a smattering of polite, envious applause, and another bond of power and prestige would be forged. Lily watched as Bryony Bennet, radiant in a gown of crimson silk, held her breath, her eyes fixed on a handsome young alpha from the Sunstone Pack. The beam passed her by, and Bryony's perfect lips tightened in a brief, venomous scowl before her mask of poise slipped back into place. Finally, only one alpha remained. A hush, deeper and more profound than before, fell over the hall. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. Alpha Wolfe of the Ironclaw Dominion stepped from the shadows of a high balcony where he had been observing the proceedings like an eagle in its eyrie. He moved with a silent, fluid grace that was utterly terrifying, a predator descending upon a field of unsuspecting prey. He was a legend, a myth whispered in hushed tones, a ruthless billionaire, an old money magnate, and a warrior who had carved his dominion out of chaos and blood. He was impossibly tall, with shoulders as broad as a mountain pass, and he radiated an aura of such intense, predatory power that the very air around him seemed to crackle and bend to his will. The elder stepped back, a flicker of fear in his ancient eyes, as Wolfe took his place on the dais. The orb of Selene pulsed violently, its light flaring to a blinding intensity. The hum became a deafening roar that vibrated through Lily's very soul. Then the light exploded. It did not form a single beam, but a searing wave of silver fire that washed over the entire crowd. Gasps of shock and confusion rippled through the hall. The magic was a living thing, a wild, untamed force, searching, seeking. It found her. The light coalesced, retracting from the stunned crowd and forming a single incandescent beam. It shot across the room, a silver arrow of fate, bypassing the rows of hopeful heiresses, the daughters of powerful alphas, the beautifully adorned she-wolves at the front. It shot straight to the back of the hall,
to the forgotten shadows where a small, terrified Omega was trying to will herself into non-existence. It struck Lily. The world dissolved into white-hot agony. A scream was ripped from her throat as a burning sensation erupted on the delicate skin of her left wrist. She looked down in horror to see an intricate mark searing itself into her flesh. A snarling wolf head framed by sharp, unforgiving iron claws. The sigil of the Ironclaw Dominion, the mark of Alpha Wolf. Her scream died, choked off by the utter, crushing silence that descended upon the hall. The hum of the orb faded, leaving a deafening ringing in Lily's ears. Every single eye was fixed on her. The weight of their collective stare was a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. She could see the shock, the disbelief, and the utter, naked contempt on the faces of the Bennett family. Her gaze, against her will, was drawn back to the dais. Alpha Wolf was staring directly at her. His handsome face was a mask of cold, controlled fury. His eyes, the color of a gathering storm, were narrowed into slits, and in their depths, Lily saw not the joy of a wolf who had found his mate, but the incandescent rage of a king who had been handed a profound and public insult.
The bond, newly forged and brutally unwelcome, slammed into her. It was a torrent of his emotions, disbelief, disgust, fury, and a possessiveness so absolute, so suffocating, it felt like an iron chain wrapping around her soul. He was a tempest, and she was a sapling about to be ripped from the earth and shattered. No, the word was a ragged whisper, a denial torn from the deepest part of her being. It was a mistake. It had to be. She stumbled back, her hand flying to cover the burning, agonizing mark on her wrist. The pain was unbearable, a fire crawling up her arm, twisting into the intricate shape, glowing and searing itself not just onto her skin, but into her very essence. Her breath caught in her throat, but she gritted her teeth, refusing to cry out again. The elder, recovering from his shock, raised his hands. "Behold," he declared, his voice trembling slightly. "The bond is complete. She is now bound to Alpha Wolf." The crowd murmured, a wave of shock, curiosity, and derision, but Lily felt nothing but suffocation. Her hand rested over the mark, but all she could think was how it felt like a shackle, trapping her in a life she hadn't chosen, a life with him. The fight rose within her, a desperate, defiant spark in the face of annihilation. "I won't be his," she murmured to herself, barely louder than a breath, but the words rang in her ears like a declaration of war. Lord Bennett's eyes darkened as he turned to her, his voice a low, commanding hiss that carried in the silence. "You will accept this, Lily. There's no turning back now." Lily looked up, from her benefactor to the alpha on the dais. The words sank deep, stirring something she couldn't push away. She refused to be shackled to this fate, but here she was, marked, revealed, forced to face the reality of a future she would rather die than live. She swallowed the lump in her throat, the bitterness rising as the weight of the mark on her skin felt like it was crushing her very bones. The elder stepped back, and the energy in the air slowly began to dissipate. But as the murmurs of the crowd grew louder, her resolve hardened. She wasn't sure what would come next, but she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the end. This was the beginning of her fight. Chapter 2. The Alpha's Brutal Claim. The sigil of the Ironclaw Dominion glowed faintly on her wrist, a searing brand on her very being. The entire world now knew her fate, but Lily couldn't. She wouldn't. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "I won't be his," she muttered again, this time with more force, the words a fierce, desperate prayer. They held a resolve she hadn't known she possessed. Lord Bennett stepped closer, his face tight with a mixture of frustration and raw fear. "You will accept this, Lily. Do you know what it means to defy the bond? You cannot change what is destined." His voice was firm, but there was a tremor of panic beneath it. He wasn't worried for her.
He was terrified of the Alpha she had just insulted. Lily didn't look at him. She didn't need to. She could feel the disapproval radiating from him, from his wife, from the entire assembly of nobles who were now staring at her as if she were a piece of filth that had sullied their pristine hall.
She was supposed to submit, to accept this honor without question. But the very thought of it, of belonging to that cold, ruthless man, made her skin crawl with a terror that was somehow sharper than her fear of his wrath. No, the word came out with more force than she intended, a sharp, ragged edge to it. She turned from the Bennets, her gaze finding the Alpha on the dais once more. Her eyes, filled with the fire of a cornered animal, blazed with defiance. This isn't a fate to choose. This bond isn't mine. I will not be bound to a man like him. I refuse. Her heart thundered in her chest, and for a moment she almost wavered under the crushing weight of her own audacity. But she shook it off. No, she wouldn't back down, not now. It was then that Alpha Wolfe moved. He descended from the dais, not with the fluid grace of before, but with heavy, deliberate steps. Each footfall on the marble floor was a pronouncement of doom. The crowd parted before him like the Red Sea, a silent, fearful wave of silk and bodies. He was a walking storm, and he was coming for her. The sheer, suffocating force of his presence was a physical thing. It pressed in on her, stealing the air, making her lungs burn. He stopped directly in front of her, so close she was forced to crane her neck to meet his gaze. The scent of him, pine, winter air, and raw, untamed power was dizzying, an intoxicating assault on her senses. "What?" he began, his voice a deceptively calm, low rumble that vibrated through her bones. "Did you just say?" Her defiance was a flickering candle flame in the face of his hurricane, but it was all she had left. She lifted her chin, meeting his stormy gaze head on. "I said I refuse!" A muscle feathered in his powerful jaw. His hands, which had been hanging loosely at his sides, slowly clenched into fists, the knuckles turning a stark white against his tan skin. "The goddess does not make mistakes," he growled. The sound so deep and menacing, it felt like it came from the very center of the earth. And no one, he leaned down, his face now inches from hers, his piercing eyes boring into her very being, his voice dropping to a terrifying, possessive whisper, "rejects what is mine." Before she could react, before she could even draw a breath to scream, he moved with impossible speed. His hand shot out, not to her marked wrist, but to the back of her neck. His powerful fingers tangled in her hair, his grip firm and unyielding, tilting her head to the side, bearing the vulnerable pulsing column of her throat. A wave of pure, primal panic crashed over her. She knew it was coming, the claiming, the bite that would finalize the bond, sealing it in blood and pain, making it utterly irrevocable. "No, please," she whimpered, her hands flying up to push against his chest, a pathetic, futile gesture against a wall of unmoving granite. "Please don't do this." Her plea was less than air to him. It was as if she hadn't spoken at all. His head dipped, and she could feel his hot breath ghosting across her skin. The scent of him was all-consuming, swamping her senses, even as terror screamed through her veins. His lips brushed against her pulse point, a shockingly soft, almost tender touch that was a prelude to an imaginable agony. And then, he bit her. Pain, sharp and blinding, exploded from the point of contact. His fangs, long and brutally sharp, sank deep into her flesh. It wasn't a nip. It was a brand, a mark of absolute ownership being seared into her very soul. A scream tore from her throat, raw and anguished. Her vision swam, black spots dancing at the edges, as the world tilted violently on its axis. Through the searing, venomous pain, she felt the bond flare to life, no longer a tentative connection, but a roaring, undeniable conduit of power. His essence flooded into her,
possessive and absolute. It was an invasion, a violation on a spiritual level that was far worse than the physical wound. She felt him pouring into her, marking her, changing her, claiming every single fiber of her being as irrevocably his. She was no longer just Lily. She was his. He held the bite for a long, agonizing moment, his growl a low, rumbling vibration against her skin, a sound of grim satisfaction. Then, just as she felt her consciousness begin to fray at the edges, he released her. Lily staggered back, her legs buckling beneath her. She would have collapsed onto the floor in a heap, but his hand shot out, grabbing her upper arm in a bruising iron grip, holding her upright. She clutched at her neck, her fingers coming away slick and warm with her own blood. The wound burned with a venomous fire, but beneath the pain, a new, sickening sensation was taking root, a deep, thrumming pull toward him, an instinctual, biological craving for the very man who had just violated her so completely. "You are mine," Wolfe said, his voice a low, possessive growl that brooked no argument and offered no comfort. His stormy eyes raked over her, no longer just with fury, but with a dark, predatory satisfaction. He looked at the blood on her fingers, then at the new, permanent mark taking root on her neck, and a cruel, triumphant smirk touched his lips. "Whether you accept it or not is irrelevant. The bond is sealed. You belong to me now." He released her arm and she stumbled, catching herself against a pillar. Her body trembled uncontrollably, a storm of pain, fear, and utter humiliation raging within her. The entire world of the Allied Pax had just witnessed her degradation. She was a spectacle, an Omega who had dared to defy an Alpha, and had been brutally, publicly put back in her place. Without another glance at her, Wolfe turned. His imperious gaze swept the room, an unspoken challenge to anyone who might dare to question his actions. No one moved. No one spoke. No one met his eye. He was the undisputed king in this hall, and he had just made his power terrifyingly, irrevocably clear. He strode toward the main doors, his advisors materializing from the crowd to fall into step behind him like shadows. As he passed the Bennets, he paused for a fraction of a second, his voice carrying easily in the dead silence. "Have her ready. My men will collect her at dawn." It wasn't a request, it was a royal decree. And then he was gone, the great doors booming shut behind him, leaving Lily bleeding, trembling, and utterly broken in the ruins of her life. The silence he left in his wake was heavier, more damning than the chaos that had come before. Her fate was sealed, not by a benevolent goddess, but by the merciless bite of an Alpha Lord. This was not a bond of love. This was only the beginning of her subjugation. Chapter 3: The House of Scorn. The moment the great doors boomed shut behind Alpha Wolfe, the dam of stunned silence broke. A torrent of hushed, scandalized whispers flooded the great hall. Lily remained pressed against the pillar, the cold, unforgiving marble a stark contrast to the fire raging in her veins from the claiming bite on her neck. The pull of the bond was a nauseating, physical thing, a constant tug in the direction Wolfe had departed, as if a cruel hook had been lodged deep in her soul, pulling her toward her captor. Her vision was blurry with unshed tears, but she could see the Bennets approaching, their faces contorted with rage. Lord Bennet's features were a mask of cold fury, his lips a thin white line of suppressed anger. Lady Bennet looked as though she had smelled something foul, her nose wrinkled in utter disgust. But it was Bryony's expression that cut the deepest, a vicious, triumphant smirk that reveled in Lily's public humiliation. "You foolish, ungrateful little whelp," Lord Bennet hissed, his voice low and venomous to avoid causing a wider scene, though every word was a lash. "Do you have any idea what you have done, the damage you have caused?" Lily couldn't speak. Her throat felt raw from her scream, and the shame was a physical weight crushing her chest, making it impossible to breathe. They had embarrassed them. She, the charity case, the Omega orphan, had been linked to the most powerful alpha on the continent and had thrown it back in his face, shaming her benefactors in the process. "You have brought disgrace and ruin upon this house," Lady Bennet added, her voice dripping with ice. "After everything we have done for you, taking you in when you were a worthless, parentless stray, feeding you, clothing you, this is how you repay us? By making a spectacle and insulting Alpha Wolfe himself?" I didn't ask for this," Lily finally choked out, her hand still protectively covering the throbbing, bleeding wound on her neck. The pain was a constant, sharp reminder of her new reality. "You don't get to ask," Bryony snapped, stepping forward, her crimson dress a slash of color against Lily's pale fear. "You're an Omega, an orphan. The goddess must have been drunk to choose you for an alpha like him. You should have been on your knees, thanking her, thanking us for the opportunity. Instead, you spat in his face, in all of our faces." A flash of red hair pushed through the small crowd of onlookers that had lingered to watch the drama unfold. "Leave her alone!" Chloe's voice was a whip crack in the tense air. Her green eyes flashed with protective fury as she put a firm arm around Lily's trembling shoulders. "Can't you see she's hurt? He attacked her in front of all of you, and you just stood there." Lord Bennet shot Chloe a look that could have frozen fire. "This does not concern you, girl. This is a family matter." He turned his cold, merciless gaze back to Lily, his voice dropping to a final, damning verdict. "Alpha Wolfe's men will be here at dawn. You will be packed and ready to go. You are no longer welcome in this house. You are his problem now." The finality in his words was like a physical blow, knocking the last of the air from her lungs. She had known the Bennets' charity was a thin veneer over their disdain, but she had always had a roof over her head, a place to call, if not a home, then at least a shelter. Now even that was gone. They were casting her out without a second thought, throwing her to the wolf who had already claimed her so brutally. "Come on, Lily. Let's get you out of here," Chloe said gently, her voice a small point of warmth in the freezing, cavernous emptiness that was enveloping Lily's world. She guided Lily away from the snaring faces of the Bennets and through the gawking crowd. The whispers followed them like a trail of poison, sharp and cruel. "Did you see his face? She rejected him. An Omega, can you imagine? He bit her right there, serves her right." Chloe led her up the winding back staircases, away from the opulence and into the servants' domain, finally reaching the attic and the small, sparse room that had been Lily's sanctuary. Once inside, with the plain wooden door shut, the fragile composure Lily had been clinging to with her fingernails finally shattered. A sob, raw and ugly, tore from her throat, and she collapsed onto her narrow, lumpy bed, her body shaking with uncontrollable, violent tremors. The physical pain in her neck was a constant, throbbing reminder, but it was nothing compared to the agony in her soul. Chloe sat beside her, rubbing her back in soothing, steady circles. "I'm so sorry, Lily. I am so sorry. It's a nightmare." "What am I going to do, Chloe?" Lily wept, her face buried in the thin, worn blanket that smelled of lavender and loneliness. "They're throwing me out. I have nowhere to go. I have to go with him. That monster. I felt his anger through the bond. It was like nothing I've ever imagined. It was cold and sharp, and it wanted to destroy me. He hates me." "He doesn't hate you, Lily," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "He's a possessive, arrogant alpha who just got publicly rejected by his fated mate. His pride is wounded, that's all. The bond feels like a cage," Lily sobbed, her fingers digging into the fabric of the blanket. "I can feel him, even now. He's gone, but he's still here. It's this constant pull. This need. It's not mine. It's his. He's forcing it on me. And the way he looked at me, with such satisfaction after he hurt me. He enjoyed it, Chloe. He enjoyed breaking me. Chloe was silent for a long moment, the grim reality of the situation settling heavily in the small room. She knew the legends about fated mates, the overwhelming, all-consuming love that was supposed to blossom into a perfect union. This was not that. This was a violation, a conquest, a brutal act of possession. "Then you have to be smart, Lily," Chloe said finally, her tone turning serious, her hand gripping Lily's shoulder firmly. "Listen to me. You can't fight him head-on. He's too powerful. You saw what happened tonight. Defying him openly will only get you hurt or worse. You have to be like water. Find the cracks. Flow around the obstacles. Bide your time. You have to survive." Survive. The word echoed in the small, dusty room. That's what her life had been reduced to. She was no longer a person with hopes and dreams, however small and quiet they had been. She was now a possession, a conquered territory, and her only goal was to survive the reign of her new, merciless lord. "I can't be his," Lily whispered, her voice raw with grief. "I can't let him own my soul. I'd rather die." "Don't you dare say that," Chloe said fiercely, her green eyes flashing. "You are stronger than you think you are. You stood up to him, Lily. In that hall, for 1 second, you were the most powerful person in the room because you were the only one who wasn't afraid. No one else would have dared. That fire inside you, don't let him put it out. Just learn to shield the flame, hide it, protect it, and wait for your moment." As the night bled into the early hours of the morning, Chloe helped Lily clean the bite mark on her neck. Her touch was gentle, her presence a small, vital comfort in a world that had turned hostile. The wound was already beginning to heal, the skin knitting together with the unnatural speed of shifter biology. It was clear that by morning, it would be a permanent, intricate scar that resembled the snarling wolf from the mark on her wrist. It was a brand, a slave's mark. They packed the few belongings Lily owned into a small, worn satchel, 2 simple mended dresses, a well-loved book of fairy tales her mother used to read to her, and a small, smooth river stone she'd kept in her pocket for as long as she could remember. It was a pitifully small collection to represent an entire life. As the first pale gray fingers of dawn began to streak the sky, a heavy, authoritative knock echoed from the main door downstairs. It was time. Lily stood, her small satchel clutched in her hand. Her face was pale and tear-streaked, her eyes swollen, but as she looked at her reflection in the small, cracked mirror on the wall, she saw something new flickering in their depths, a fragile, steely resolve. Chloe was right. Open defiance was suicide. She had to survive. She would go with his men. She would enter his gilded cage, but she made a silent, solemn vow to the broken girl staring back at her. He might have claimed her body, he might have sealed the bond with his fangs, but he would never, ever have her soul. She would protect that flame, no matter the cost. With a deep, shuddering breath, she walked out of her small attic room for the last time, descending the stairs to meet her fate. Chapter 4. The Tower of Glass. The men who came for her were like their alpha, large, silent, and radiating an aura of disciplined menace. They were dressed in the same impeccable black suits of the advisors from the night before, their faces impassive stone, their eyes missing nothing. They didn't speak to the Bennets, who hovered in the grand doorway. Their relief at her departure was a palpable, ugly thing. The men simply looked at Lily, their gazes acknowledging her not as a person, but as a package to be collected. One of them, a man with a jagged white scar cutting across his cheek, gestured curtly towards a sleek black car that idled at the end of the long driveway, like a patient beast of prey. There were no goodbyes. Lord and Lady Bennet turned their backs the moment she stepped over the threshold, already closing the door on her past. Brianni watched from an upstairs window, a smug, triumphant look of satisfaction on her face. Only Chloe ran out after her, defying the Bennets' cold dismissal, and pulled her into a fierce, desperate hug on the gravel drive. "Be safe, Lily," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. She pressed a small, hastily wrapped parcel into Lily's hand. "It's just some bread and cheese. I don't know when they'll feed you. And remember what I said. Be water. You find a way to wear down the stone." Tears pricked Lily's eyes as she clutched the precious, simple parcel. It felt like the only real thing in a world that had become a terrifying fiction. "Thank you, Chloe, for everything." The scarred man cleared his throat, a low, impatient sound that cut the farewell short. Chloe squeezed her hand one last time and stepped back, her face a mask of worried defiance. Lily turned and walked toward the car, her back straight, her head held high. She refused to let them see her crumble. She was terrified, a raw, screaming knot of fear coiled in her stomach. But she would not show it. She would not give them that satisfaction. The car was the epitome of cold, hard luxury, its black leather interior smelling of wealth and power. It was also, she quickly discovered, a cage. The windows were tinted so dark she couldn't see out, only vague shapes and shadows. When she tentatively reached for the door handle, she found only a smooth, unbroken panel of leather. There was no escape. The ride was long and unnervingly silent, taking her far from the familiar forests and territories of Silverwood and deep into the heart of the iron-clawed dominion. The landscape, what little she could sense of it, seemed to grow harsher, more rugged. When the car finally slowed, it wasn't to the gates of a medieval-style castle or a traditional pack manor. It descended into a subterranean parking garage, and she was led to a private, silent elevator. The elevator ascended at a dizzying speed, the silence broken only by the soft, electronic chime as it passed floor after floor. It opened directly into a vast, sprawling penthouse that seemed to occupy the entire top floor of a skyscraper. Lily stepped out and froze, her breath catching in her throat. This was to be her new home, her new prison. It was a cage made of glass, steel, and cold, modernist luxury. Floor-to-ceiling windows on all sides offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the sprawling city below and the wild's untamed mountains that ringed it in the distance. The floors were polished black marble that reflected the gray sky like a dark, still lake. The furniture was sleek, minimalist, and looked profoundly uncomfortable. The art on the walls was abstract and unsettling, splashes of angry color on vast white canvases. There was no warmth, no comfort, no clutter, no sign of a life lived. It was beautiful, sterile, and utterly soulless, a perfect reflection of its owner. "The Alpha is occupied," the scarred man said, his voice a gravelly rasp. It was the first time he had spoken directly to her since they'd left Silverwood. "He has instructed that you are to be shown to your suite. You are not to leave it without his permission. All of your needs will be provided for." The words were delivered with the flat, impersonal tone of a prison guard reading regulations. He led her down a long, echoing hallway to a set of imposing double doors. He pushed them open, revealing a suite that was larger than the entire Bennett's ground floor. It was decorated in muted shades of gray, silver, and cream, dominated by a massive bed that looked large enough for 4 people. There was a sitting area with a sleek, modern fireplace that was currently dark, and an adjoining bathroom of white marble and chrome that looked like a private spa. A walk-in closet stood open, and Lily's eyes widened at the sight of it. It was filled to bursting with clothes, dresses, slacks, sweaters, shoes, lingerie, all in her size, all from designers whose names she had only ever seen in glossy magazines. It was a lavish, beautiful, and utterly insulting prison cell, a princess's dungeon. "Your meals will be brought to you," the man said from the doorway, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Do not attempt to leave." And with that, he pulled the door shut. Lily heard the distinct, heavy thump click of an electronic lock engaging. She was a prisoner. A wave of desperate, clawing claustrophobia washed over her. She rushed to the massive window that made up one entire wall of the bedroom. The view was incredible. The city a toy set far below, but it only served to emphasize her captivity. She was high above the world, trapped in a tower of glass, completely and utterly at the mercy of the man who had brought her here. For hours, she did nothing. She sat on the edge of the ridiculously soft bed, her small, worn satchel clutched in her lap, feeling utterly out of place. This was a world she didn't belong in. The luxury was an insult, a way of reminding her of the chasm between them, of the power he wielded, of how easily he could provide everything she could ever want, except for the one thing she craved more than air itself: freedom. Eventually, a soft knock came at the door. A young woman in a simple gray uniform entered, carrying a silver tray laden with food. It was a gourmet meal: perfectly roasted chicken, fragrant wild rice, and delicate asparagus spears. The woman, in omega like herself, kept her eyes downcast, her demeanor nervous and subservient. "Your dinner, ma'am," she whispered, placing the tray on a small table near the window. Lily looked at the delicious food and then at the terrified girl. Her stomach clenched with hunger, but her resolve hardened into a sharp, cold point. This was it, her first act of rebellion. It was small, pathetic even, but it was hers. She couldn't fight him with strength, but she could resist. She could refuse to be a docile, cooperative prisoner. "I'm not hungry," she said, her voice quiet but firm. The girl looked up, her eyes wide with panic. "But the Alpha said you must eat. Please, ma'am, he will be very angry. Please don't get me in trouble." The girl's fear was a tool, another one of his weapons. Lily's resolve solidified. "Then let him be angry," she said, turning her back to the girl and walking to the window, presenting him with her defiant back. "I am not hungry. You may take it away." The maid hesitated for a long, agonizing moment, then practically fled the room, leaving the tray of food behind. Lily stared out at the city lights twinkling to life as dusk fell. She hadn't won a battle, not really, but she had drawn a line in the sand. She would not eat his food. She would not wear his clothes. She would not sleep in his bed. She would hold on to the tiny piece of herself that was still her own for as long as she possibly could. An hour later, the doors to her suite flew open with a force that made her jump, slamming against the interior walls. Alpha Wolf stood there, his presence instantly sucking all the air from the room. He had shed his suit jacket and tie, and his pristine white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, the sleeves rolled up to reveal muscular, tattooed forearms. He looked even more dangerous, more primal, without the veneer of formal civility. His stormy eyes immediately fell on the untouched dinner tray. A low, menacing growl rumbled in his chest, a sound that vibrated through the floorboards. "You will eat," he said. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order infused with the raw power of his alpha will, a command designed to bypass thought and compel obedience. Lily felt the command wash over her, a physical pressure demanding she submit. Her instincts screamed at her to obey, but she fought it. She wrapped her arms around herself, her knuckles turning white. "No," she whispered. The single whispered word of defiance hung in the air between them, a fragile thread against his iron will. Wolf's eyes narrowed into dangerous slits, the storm in their great depths intensifying. He stalked into the room, his movements a symphony of barely restrained violence. He stopped in front of her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. So close, she was forced to tilt her head back to look up at his harsh, handsome face. "This is not a game, little mate," he snarled, his voice a low, menacing purr that was more terrifying than any shout. "You are in my house, under my protection, and you will follow my rules. Your pathetic attempts at defiance are tiresome." His gaze flickered to the untouched dinner tray and back to her. "Now you will
eat.
And if I don't, she challenged, her voice trembling but laced with courage she didn't know she possessed. What will you do? Bite me again? Humiliate me further? Don't tempt me. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper that was for her ears alone, a silken threat that slid under her skin. I have ways of compelling obedience that are far less pleasant than a claiming bite. Do not test my patience. It is already hanging by a very thin, frayed thread. With that, he turned and strode out of the room, slamming the doors behind him with a thunderous crack. The electronic lock clicked back into place, a sound of finality sealing her in with the scent of his anger and the untouched meal. Lily sank onto the floor, her back against the cold glass of the window, pulling her knees to her chest. Her body was trembling, but a cold, hard knot of determination was forming in her gut. He thought he could break her. He thought he could starve her into submission. But he didn't know her. He didn't know the stubborn, resilient core of the girl who had survived being an orphan, who had endured years of scorn from the Bennets. This gilded cage might be his, but her will was still her own. The next 24 hours passed in a silent, drawn-out battle, a siege of wills. 3 times, a maid, each one looking more terrified than the last, brought a tray of exquisite food to her suite. 3 times, Lily refused to touch it. Her stomach twisted into a painful, cramping knot of hunger, but her resolve was fueled by pure, unadulterated spite. She survived on the last of the bread and cheese Chloe had given her, rationing it into tiny, precious bites, and drank water from the opulent bathroom tap. She refused to touch the clothes in the closet, remaining in the simple gray dress she'd been wearing for 2 days, now wrinkled and smelling of fear and travel. She refused to sleep in the massive bed which felt like a sacrificial altar. Instead, she curled up in a plush armchair in the corner, her small satchel held tightly to her chest like a shield, dozing in short, restless bursts, her dreams filled with the image of stormy eyes and the phantom pain of fangs in her neck. Her only company was the city skyline, a glittering, indifferent audience to her solitary confinement. The bond was a constant, agonizing presence. It was a dull ache in her soul, a persistent hum of Wolfe's power, his nearness, his simmering irritation. She could feel his frustration mounting with every meal she refused, and a small, bitter part of her took a grim satisfaction in knowing she was, in some small way, affecting him, that she was not entirely powerless. Late on the second night, the doors to her suite opened again. This time, it wasn't a maid. It was Wolfe. He was dressed in a simple black t-shirt and gray sweatpants, looking less like a billionaire alpha wolf and more like a dangerous predator in its den. He held no food tray. His hands were empty, but his eyes were filled with a cold, hard light that made Lily's blood run cold. He was done playing games. He said nothing. He simply walked to the dinner tray from hours earlier, which still sat on the table, and looked at the untouched food. Then he turned his gaze on her, where she sat huddled in the armchair, her small frame looking even smaller in the vast, luxurious room. He took in her wrinkled dress, the dark, bruising circles under her eyes, and the stubborn, defiant set of her jaw. "This ends now," he said, his voice a low, flat statement of fact. Lily scrambled to her feet, putting the armchair between them like a flimsy shield. The hunger had made her weak, her head feel light. "I told you I'm not—" "You will join me for dinner," he interrupted, his voice laced with an authority that was absolute, leaving no room for argument. "In the main dining room. In 10 minutes. You will go to that closet, you will wear something appropriate, and you will present yourself at my table. If you are not there," he paused, his eyes locking with hers, "I will come back in here and I will dress you myself.
Then I will carry you to the table, and I will feed you like a recalcitrant child.
The choice, for the last time, is yours." The casual, callous way he laid out her options, the utter, contemptuous lack of respect for her autonomy, sent a fresh wave of rage through her. The threat of being manhandled, of being stripped and dressed and humiliated in such a base, physical way was abhorrent. A deeper, more primal part of her recoiled at the thought of his hands on her again, of his strength so easily overwhelming her. He saw the war in her eyes, the fierce battle between her pride and her instinct for self-preservation. A flicker of dark, grim amusement crossed his features. "10 minutes, Lily," he said, before turning and leaving, the doors clicking shut behind him once more, the lock disengaging with an audible sigh of electronics. Lily stood, trembling, her fists clenched so tightly her nails bit into her palms. He had her trapped. If she refused, he would make good on his threat. She had no doubt of that. The public humiliation of being carried and force-fed was a degradation she couldn't bear. But to obey? To dress in his clothes and eat his food at his table felt like a complete and utter surrender. Her eyes fell to the closet, filled with silks and cashmeres, a costume for his prisoner. A bitter, hopeless laugh escaped her. Fine. He wanted her to play the part of his mate. She would play it, but she would do it on her own terms. With shaking, weak hands, she walked to the closet. She ignored the glittering evening gowns and elegant dresses. Her eyes landed on the simplest, most severe item she could find: a pair of black, perfectly tailored trousers and a plain, cream-colored silk blouse with long sleeves. It wasn't a dress for a mate. It was armor. She quickly splashed cold water on her face and brushed her hair, pulling it back into a tight, severe knot at the nape of her neck. When she looked in the mirror, she barely recognized the pale, gaunt woman staring back. There was a hardness in her eyes, a brittle strength that hadn't been there before. With seconds to spare, she walked to the doors of her suite. She placed her hand on the handle, and taking a deep, steadying breath, stepped out into the hallway. She followed the long, echoing corridor toward the faint sound of soft, classical music. The dining room was as grand and impersonal as the rest of the penthouse. A long, polished obsidian table that could seat 20 was set for only 2, at opposite ends, a vast, empty battlefield between them. Wolfe was already there, a glass of red wine in his hand. He watched her approach, his eyes sweeping over her chosen attire with an unreadable expression. "Punctual," he commented, his voice dry. "Have a seat." She sat, her back ramrod straight, at the far end of the table, the vast expanse of polished stone between them a stark symbol of the chasm that separated their worlds. Servants appeared as if from nowhere, placing plates of food in front of them. It was a perfectly cooked steak with roasted root vegetables. The aroma made her stomach cramp with a painful, desperate hunger. For several minutes, they ate in a tense, suffocating silence, the only sound the clink of silverware against porcelain. Lily forced herself to eat slowly, methodically, refusing to show the ravenous hunger that clawed at her insides. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her wolf down his food like a starving stray. Finally, Wolfe set down his fork and fixed her with his intense, stormy gaze. "Why are you fighting me so hard, Lily?" he asked, his tone less aggressive, more genuinely curious. "This is your life now. The sooner you accept it, the easier it will be for both of us. Easier for you means compliant for me," she shot back, her voice sharper than she intended. "I will not be a dog that comes to heel just because you are the alpha." His eyes narrowed, he stared at her, and for the first time she saw something other than anger or amusement in his eyes. It was a flicker of something else. Frustration, yes, but it seemed deeper than that. "You know nothing of my world, of the responsibilities I carry. Power is not just a privilege, it is a weapon. It must be displayed or it will be challenged. Your public rejection was a challenge. I answered it.
That is how this world works. So I'm just a part of your political strategy? Lily asked, her voice laced with the bitterness that tasted like bile. You are my fated mate, he suddenly roared, slamming his open palm on the table. The force of the blow was like a thunderclap, making the heavy plates and crystal glasses jump. The sudden explosion of raw, uncontrolled anger made Lily flinch violently, her heart leaping into her throat. His icy control had finally, spectacularly snapped. The raw, wounded emotion in his voice stunned her into silence. It wasn't just the wounded pride of an alpha. It was the deeper, more personal fury of a man. The bond between them pulsed violently, and for a fleeting, shocking second, she felt a wave of his pain, a profound sense of rejection and humiliation that mirrored her own feelings of violation. The realization was dizzying, terrifying. He, the all-powerful, merciless Alpha Wolf, had been hurt. The War of Wills was not over, but its landscape had just irrevocably and dangerously shifted. Chapter 6: Scars of the Father. The echo of Wolf's outburst hung in the vast, silent dining room, a charged and heavy presence. Lily stared at him from across the chasm of polished obsidian, her own anger momentarily eclipsed by a profound, disorienting shock. The raw, almost vulnerable fury he had displayed was so contrary to the image of the cold, unfeeling tyrant she had constructed in her mind. The bond, that traitorous, unwelcome connection, had given her a glimpse of the genuine sting his pride had suffered, and it left her feeling unmoored and dangerously confused. Wolfe seemed to realize he had revealed far more than he intended. He visibly reined in his temper, his broad shoulders tensing as he forced himself back under his iron control. He ran a hand through his dark, disheveled hair, a gesture of profound frustration, and leaned back in his chair, his stormy eyes avoiding hers, fixing instead on some point in the middle distance. The servants, who had frozen in place in the shadowed doorways at his outburst, discreetly melted back into the unseen corridors of the penthouse, leaving them utterly alone once more. The silence that fell was different from before. It was no longer just tense. It was heavy with unspoken complexities, with the ghosts of a past she was only now beginning to comprehend. I was born into this, Wolfe said suddenly, his voice low and gravelly, directed more at the glass of deep red wine in his hand than at her. This power, this dominion. My father, the previous Alpha Lord, was a tyrant in the truest sense of the word. He ruled the iron-clawed dominion not with respect, but with absolute fear. Weakness, in his eyes, was the greatest sin imaginable. Emotions, compassion, vulnerability, he saw them as cancers to be carved out with a hot knife. Lily listened, mesmerized by herself. He had never spoken of his past. The legends and rumors painted him as a carbon copy of his father, only more successful, more brutally efficient. He saw the fated mate bond as the ultimate weakness. My mother was his chosen mate. He adored her, but he saw that love as a liability, a chink in his armor. His enemies knew it too. When I was 10 years old, they used her to get to him. A rival pack, one he had humiliated but not destroyed, kidnapped her. My father, instead of negotiating or showing any sign of compromise, which he would have seen as weakness, went to war. He rode out with his warriors and he slaughtered them all. But he was too late. They had already killed her, just to prove they could hurt him. A chill, sharp and cruel, traced its way down Lily's spine. She pictured a young boy, not much older than a child, watching his father's greatest love become his most fatal flaw. He changed after that, Will said distantly, his gaze distant, lost in a painful, visceral memory. He finally looked at her, and the cold fury in his eyes had been replaced by a deep, hollow weariness that seemed ancient and profound. When he died, the Dominion was on the brink of civil war. His brutality had created enemies everywhere. I inherited a kingdom of wolves who feared me but did not respect me. I had to be twice as strong, twice as ruthless as he ever was, just to hold it all together. I have spent the last 15 years of my life
fighting, crushing rebellions, forging alliances through intimidation and force, because that is the only way I know. It is the only way I was taught to survive. Lily said nothing. What could she possibly say? His story wasn't an excuse for his actions, for the way he had treated her with such brutal possession, but it was an explanation. It was the first crack in the marble facade of the monster, the first glimpse of the man who had been forged in the cruelest of fires, shaped by trauma and a terrible, lonely responsibility. He wasn't just a monster. He was the product of a monstrous upbringing, a legacy of violence and fear. "So when the goddess marked you," he said, his voice now barely a whisper, a sound of raw confession in the silent room, "this Omega girl from a minor house, who looked at me not with ambition or awe, but with pure terror, and then had the audacity to reject me in front of the entire world, it was a confirmation of my father's every single lesson. It was a weakness, a vulnerability, a threat to my authority that I could not afford." "So you bit me," Lily stated, the words soft but heavy, with a new, complicated understanding. "To turn a weakness back into a show of strength, to reassert control." He nodded, not a hint of apology in his expression, only a grim, unwavering acceptance of the facts as he saw them. "I did what I was trained to do. I asserted dominance. I eliminated the threat." The logic was cold, brutal, and entirely in character. And yet, hearing him explain it, hearing the ghost of a 10-year-old boy who lost his mother lingering in his voice, chipped away at the solid, impenetrable wall of her hatred. It didn't excuse the fear and humiliation he had put her through, but it made it comprehensible. It made him comprehensible. "I am not your mother," Lily said, her voice quiet but firm, a clear, ringing note in the heavy silence. "And I am not a weakness." For the first time since she had met him, a flicker of something utterly unreadable crossed his face. It wasn't anger. It wasn't frustration. It looked almost like confusion, as if she had presented him with a concept his mind did not know how to process, a variable that did not fit into his violent, rigid equation of the world. He stood up abruptly, the legs of his heavy chair scraping harshly against the marble floor. The moment of vulnerability, of shared history, was over. The Alpha Lord was back, the mask of cold command slipping back into place as if it had never left. "Finish your meal," he commanded, though the order lacked the sharp, threatening edge it had held before. It sounded more like a dismissal. "We have a gala to attend in 3 days. It is a necessary political and business event. All the major PACs and their human corporate affiliates will be there. You will be by my side. I will not have my mate hiding in this tower like a dirty secret or a madwoman in the attic. You will be presented to society, and you will behave accordingly." He didn't wait for a response. He turned and strolled from the room, his broad back rigid, leaving Lily alone in the vast, empty dining hall. She stared at the space he had just vacated, her mind reeling, her half-eaten meal forgotten. The fear was still there, a cold, persistent knot in her stomach. The anger at her captivity and his high-handedness had not vanished. But now they were joined by a new, insidious, and entirely unwelcome emotion. A sliver of empathy. He had shown her a glimpse of his scars, the deep foundational wounds that had shaped the man, the Alpha, the Lord. He had shown her his weakness. Not the weakness of love he so feared, but the weakness of a man who had never been taught any language other than violence and control. And in that glimpse, Lily saw not just a monster to be hated, but a profoundly damaged man to be pitied. And that, she realized with a dawning sense of dread, was infinitely more dangerous to her resolve than his anger had ever been.
Chapter 7. The Alpha's Jealousy. The 3 days leading up to the gala were a period of strange, unspoken truths. Wolfe did that visit her suite again, leaving her to the silent, solitary company of the skyline. Her meals were delivered on time by a nervous maid, and Lily, haunted by the flicker of vulnerability he had shown, ate them without protest. It wasn't submission, it was a strategic retreat. A silent acknowledgement that her previous method of defiance, the hunger strike, was a blunt instrument, and that this new, more complex dynamic required a different, more subtle approach. She needed to conserve her strength for a fight she couldn't yet define. The afternoon of the gala, 2 women she had never seen before arrived at her suite. They were not nervous omegas, but confident, sharp-eyed professionals, their arms laden with garment bags and sleek silver makeup cases. "Alpha Wolfe has requested we prepare you for this evening," the taller one announced, her tone polite but brooking no argument. Lily felt a familiar surge of hot resistance. She was to be dressed up like a doll, costumed for her public debut as his prized possession. She opened her mouth to refuse, to tell them to take their silks and paints and leave, but the memory of his cold threat to dress her himself stopped her. Choosing her own severe, armor-like clothing for their private dinner was one thing. A full-blown battle over a gown for a major political event was one she knew she would lose, and lose humiliatingly. She swallowed her pride, a bitter, hard pill, and gave a curt, silent nod. They worked for hours with an unnerving efficiency. They styled her long, dark hair into a cascade of soft, elegant waves that fell over one shoulder. Her makeup was expertly, subtly applied, making her green eyes seem larger and more luminous, giving her a look of sophisticated confidence that she absolutely did not feel. Finally, they presented her with the dress. It was a masterpiece. Crafted from a deep, liquid emerald silk, it clung to her curves like a second skin. The design was daringly simple, a high neck, long sleeves, but a back that was cut daringly low, and the slip that ran from the hem high up her thigh. When she looked in the full-length mirror, she felt a dizzying sense of dissociation. The woman staring back was a stranger, a glamorous, beautiful creature exuding a power and sensuality that felt utterly alien. The only thing that anchored her to reality, the only thing that felt truly hers, was the intricate silver scar of his claiming bite. It was starkly, deliberately visible against the smooth skin of her neck, a beautiful brand on a prized animal, a work of art made from her pain. When the stylists were finished, their final touches complete, Wolfe himself appeared at her open doorway. He was dressed in a tuxedo that was a work of art in its own right, tailored to perfection over his powerful warrior's frame. He looked like a dark prince from one of the violent, bloody fairy tales her mother used to read her, beautiful and deadly in equal, terrifying measure. His stormy eyes swept over her, a slow, appraising gaze that took in every detail, from the top of her elegantly styled hair to the tips of her delicate silver heels. His eyes stopped for a long moment on the scar at her neck. An unreadable expression flickered in their great depths. Possessiveness, pride, and something else, something deeper, more complex that she couldn't name. "Acceptable," was all he said, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that seemed to settle deep in her bones. He held out his arm, a silent command. "It is time." Her hand trembled as she placed it on his forearm. The muscle there was like steel beneath the fine expense of fabric. The simple contact sent a jolt of awareness through her, the bond between them flaring to life, a low, persistent hum of energy under her skin that was both sickening and thrilling. The gala was being held in a grand ballroom on a lower floor of the skyscraper. The moment they entered, a hush fell over the chattering crowd. Every eye, wolf and human alike, turned to them. Lily felt a hot blush creep up her neck, but she forced herself to keep her head held high, her expression a mask of cool neutrality. She was on a stage now, and she would not falter.
The room was a sea of power and influence. Alphas in tailored suits and their mates in glittering gowns mingled with human CEOs and political figures. The air buzzed with political maneuvering and high-stakes business deals. Wolfe guided her through the crowd, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back, a silent, unmistakable declaration to all who saw them. She is mine. He introduced her to a few key allies, his voice smooth and commanding. Lily played her part, offering polite smiles and murmured greetings, feeling like an actress in a play she hadn't rehearsed, her every move being judged. She could feel the stares, hear the whispers just at the edge of her hearing. That's her, the Omega. He claimed her right in the hall. She's more beautiful than I expected. Look at the mark on her neck. After what felt like an eternity, Wolfe was pulled into a deep, intense conversation with an older, formidable-looking alpha with a silver beard. For a moment, his attention was completely diverted. Lily saw her chance. She needed a moment to breathe, to escape the crushing weight of being on display. She slipped away, making her way to a quieter corner near an open balcony. A wolf does not belong in a cage, no matter how gilded it may be. The voice was smooth as velvet, laced with a charming foreign accent, and came from beside her. Lily turned to see a man leaning against the balcony railing. He was handsome in a way that was the complete opposite of Wolfe's rugged, intimidating presence. He had sun-kissed olive skin, dark, laughing eyes, and a charming, easy smile that seemed entirely genuine. He radiated a charisma that was both disarming and intensely predatory. "I am Javier, of the Sunstone Pack," he said, extending a hand. His gaze was bold, openly appreciative, and lingered on her in a way that made her feel both seen and completely exposed. "Lily," she replied, cautiously shaking his hand. His grip was firm, his skin warm. "I know who you are," he said, his smile widening. "The entire continent knows. The little Omega who tamed the great, untamable Alpha Wolf." "I assure you, I haven't tamed anyone," Lily said coolly, pulling her hand back. "No? A pity," Javier purred as he stepped a little closer. The scent of him was spicy and warm, like sun-baked earth in citrus. "A woman with your fire should not be the possession of a man who only understands ice and stone. He keeps you locked away in his tower. A man like me, I would show you off to the entire world." His flirting was blatant, almost outrageously so. It was a deliberate provocation, and she knew it. She should have walked away immediately. But there was a reckless, defiant part of her that was intrigued by this man who so fearlessly and openly poked the bear. "I am not his possession," she said, her voice firm. Javier's dark eyes glinted with mischief. "Aren't you? He has branded you for all to see." His gaze flickered meaningfully to the scar on her neck. "But a brand does not mean the spirit is broken. I can see the fight in your eyes, Lily. It is captivating." Before she could formulate a response, the temperature in the air plummeted by 20 degrees. A low, menacing growl rumbled through the room, silencing all nearby conversations, like a switch being flipped. Lily didn't need to turn to know who it was. The bond was screaming a primal warning, flooded with a wave of jealousy so potent, so murderously intense, it made her knees weak. Wolfe appeared at her side, his body a wall of solid fury. He physically placed himself between her and Javier, his posture radiating pure, undiluted aggression. His eyes fixed on the other alpha were no longer stormy gray, but had darkened to a terrifying, feral black, the pupils blown wide with rage. "Is there a problem here?" Wolfe's voice was a predator's snarl, stripped of all civility and human restraint. Javier's charming smile didn't falter, but a new tension entered his posture. He was a powerful alpha in his own right, but he was not foolish enough to challenge a furious wolf on his own territory. "No problem at all, Wolfe," he said smoothly, raising his hands in a placating gesture. just admiring your good fortune. Your mate is enchanting." "My mate is not here for your admiration," Wolfe growled, taking a threatening step forward, crowding Javier. "She is not here for your conversation. Stay away from her. Stay away from what is mine."
The possessiveness in his voice was absolute, a raw, primal claim that sent a shiver of pure fear down Lily's spine. This was not the damaged man who had shown her his scars. This was the merciless Alpha Lord, the warrior king, and his jealousy was a terrifying, monstrous thing to behold. Javier gave a slight mocking bow, his eyes still dancing with amusement. "As you wish," he said, before turning and effortlessly melting back into the crowd. Wolfe's attention snapped to Lily. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her skin like talons, his grip bruising. "We are leaving," he snarled, his voice a low, furious command meant only for her. He didn't wait for her to agree. He practically dragged her from the ballroom, ignoring the shocked stares and renewed whispers that followed in their wake. He pulled her into the private elevator, the door sliding shut to enclose them in a suffocating, silent box of mirrored steel. He was vibrating with rage. The bond was a chaotic, violent storm of his emotions. Jealousy, so sharp it was a physical pain. Fury that felt like a forest fire. And a raw, all-consuming possessiveness that sought to invade her, suffocate her, and erase her very being. He slammed his fist against the elevator wall, the impact denting the steel panel with a sickening crunch. Lily flinched, pressing herself into the far corner, her heart hammering against her ribs. For the first time since she had been brought to his tower, she felt a sliver of power. Her conversation with Javier, as innocent as it had been on her part, had provoked this. She had, however accidentally, found a chink in his impenetrable armor. She could affect him. She could make the great, unfeeling Alpha Wolf lose his iron control. The realization was both terrifying and darkly intoxicating. His jealousy was a weapon, and she had just discovered that she was the one who could wield it. The only question was, would it be the key to her salvation, or would it be the thing that ultimately destroyed her? Chapter 8. The Caged Bird's Song. The private elevator ascended in a terrifying, suffocating silence. Wolfe stood in one corner, a statue carved from rage, his fists clenched, his broad shoulders so tense they looked like they might rip through the fine fabric of his tuxedo. Lily pressed herself into the opposite corner, making herself as small as possible, her heart hammering a frantic, panicked rhythm against her ribs. The bond between them was no longer a subtle hum. It was a violent, chaotic storm of his emotions. Jealousy, so sharp it was a physical pain. Fury that felt like a forest fire. And the raw, all-consuming possessiveness that sought to invade her, suffocate her, and erase her very being. The door slid open with a soft chime that was jarringly out of place in the charged atmosphere. He grabbed her arm again, his grip like an iron manacle, and all but dragged her from the elevator, through the vast, empty penthouse, and down the long corridor to her suite. He threw the doors open and shoved her inside, not hard enough to make her fall, but with enough force to send her stumbling several feet into the room. She caught her balance, whirling around to face him, a surge of defiant anger momentarily eclipsing her fear. "How dare you?"
"How dare I?" he snarled, stepping into the room and letting the doors slam shut behind him. He stalked toward her, and she instinctively backed away until her legs hit the edge of the plush armchair. "You stand there, in my home, wearing my clothes, and you flirt with another alpha right in front of me? In front of my allies? In front of my enemies? Do you have any idea of the disrespect you have shown me?" "I was not flirting," she cried, her voice rising. "He spoke to me. I was being polite. Is that not what you wanted? For me to behave accordingly?" She threw his own words back at him like a stone. "Politeness does not involve you looking at him with wide, innocent eyes while he undresses you with his gaze." Wolfe roared, his voice bouncing off the high ceilings. "He was challenging me, you foolish girl. He was testing my control, and you were his willing pawn. I am not your pawn, she shouted back, her own temper flaring. And I am not a fool. I know exactly what he was doing, but I am also not a prisoner who is forbidden from speaking to her captors. He froze, his advance halted by her words. The rage in his eyes flickered, replaced by something colder, harder. A prisoner, he repeated, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. Is that what you think you are? What else would you call it? She asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. I am locked in this room. I am dressed like a doll for your amusement. I am paraded in front of your allies as a symbol of your power. You don't want a mate, Alpha. You want a trophy. He stared at her for a long, silent moment, his chest rising and falling with his ragged breaths. The storm of his fury seemed to recede, pulled back to reveal the icy, controlled core of the Alpha Lord. Fine, he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. If you wish to be treated like a prisoner, then you will have your wish. He turned and walked to the closet. He pulled open the doors, his gaze sweeping over the rows of beautiful, expensive clothes. With a sudden, violent movement, he swept his arm across the rack, sending a cascade of silk, cashmere, and lace dresses tumbling to the floor in a heap. Lily gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. You will not wear these again, he stated coldly. He then walked to the ensuite bathroom, emerging a moment later with the simple, drab gray uniform in his hand, the same kind worn by the Omega maids. He threw it onto the bed. This will be your attire from now on, the clothes of a servant. Since you find the role of my mate so distasteful, perhaps a role with less ambiguity will suit you better. He strode to the door, his hand resting on the handle. The door to your suite will remain unlocked. You will have the freedom of the penthouse, but you will not leave it, and you will not speak to anyone unless spoken to. Your meals will be taken here, in your room, alone. You wanted to be left alone, Lily. You wanted to be treated as something other than my mate. Congratulations. Your wish is granted. He looked over his shoulder, his stormy eyes filled with a cold, merciless light. Let's see how long you enjoy your victory.
And then he was gone, the door clicking shut softly behind him. The silence that filled the room was a crushing, suffocating thing. Lily stared at the simple gray uniform lying on the opulent bed, a stark symbol of her demotion, of her punishment. He hadn't beaten her, he hadn't physically harmed her, he had done something far crueler. He had stripped her of the one thing she had managed to cling to in this place, her status as his fated mate, however unwanted. He had reduced her from a possession to a non-entity. Tears of frustration and impotent rage burned her eyes. She had wanted to provoke him, to find a weakness. She had succeeded beyond her wildest imagination. But in doing so, she had instigated a new, colder war. She had prodded the sleeping dragon, and instead of breathing fire, it had simply frozen her out, encasing her in the prison of ice and silence. As she stood trembling in the middle of the luxurious suite, the scent of his anger still clinging to the air, a cold, hard realization dawned. Chloe's advice, to be water, to find the cracks, was more important now than ever. Direct confrontation was a fool's game. She had to be smarter, more subtle. She had learned his greatest weakness was his pride, his jealousy. It was a dangerous, volatile weapon. But if she could learn to wield it not with the clumsy force of a club, but with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, she might just find a way to cut herself free. He thought he had won this battle by isolating her, but in her isolation, she would have time to think, time to plan, time to forge her own weapons for the silent war that was to come. Chapter 9. The Poison of Whispers. The days that followed were a study in cold, silent warfare. True to his word, Wolfe left her utterly alone. The doors to her suite remained unlocked, but the penthouse was a vast, empty cage. The chatty Omega maids were replaced by a single stern-faced elder woman named Helga, whose loyalty to Wolfe was absolute, and whose disapproval of Lily was a palpable force. She would bring Lily's meals on a simple tray, her lips pressed into a permanent line of censure, and would collect the tray later without a single word. Lily wore the plain gray servant's uniform, It was a constant, itching reminder of her new station. The soft silks and cashmeres lay in a heap on the closet floor where Wolfe had thrown them, a monument to a battle she had lost. She had the freedom to wander the cold, sterile rooms of the penthouse, but it was the freedom of a ghost, unseen and unheard. Wolfe was a constant, invisible presence. She would sometimes catch his scent lingering in a hallway, or hear the distant, muffled sound of his voice from his office at the far end of the penthouse. The bond was a low, persistent thrum in the back of her mind, a constant link to his cold, simmering anger and his unwavering, watchful presence. He was ignoring her, but he was always aware of her. Lily knew she couldn't endure this forever. The silence was a poison designed to break her spirit, to make her crave any kind of attention from him, even his anger. She had to act. She had to test the new landscape of their war. Her strategy had to be subtle, a whisper rather than a shout.
One afternoon, as Helga came to collect her lunch tray, Lily spoke, her voice startling in the quiet room. "Helga," she began, keeping her tone polite, almost deferential. The older woman paused, her hand on the tray, her expression wary. "I was just wondering, the Alpha who spoke to me at the gala, Lord Javier, what is the Sunstone Pack like? I've heard their lands are very warm, very different from the mountains here." Helga's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Pack business is not for the likes of you to discuss." "Oh, of course," Lily said, her voice a perfect picture of innocence. "I wasn't asking about business. I was just curious about the geography. It must be a beautiful place. So sunny." She let a small, wistful sigh escape her lips. "I do miss the sun." It was a perfectly crafted statement, innocent on the surface, but every word was a needle aimed directly at Wolfe's pride. It implied a longing for another place, another Alpha's territory, and a connection, however tenuous, to the man who had triggered Wolfe's rage. Helga snatched the tray and left without another word, but Lily knew her message would be delivered. She was counting on it. For the rest of the day, nothing happened. A tense, waiting silence filled the penthouse. Lily's nerves were stretched taut. Had her gambit been too subtle or too obvious? Had she miscalculated? That evening, when Helga brought her dinner, there was something else on the tray besides the simple meal. A book. It was a heavy, leather-bound volume with no title on the cover. When she opened it, she saw it was a detailed, scholarly history of the Ironclaw Dominion. The message was clear. Wolfe had heard her whisper about the Sunstone Pack, and this was his answer. He would not rage, he would not shout. He would simply tighten his control, seeking to dominate not just her body, but her mind. He was trying to erase the outside world, to fill her head with nothing but the history of his land, his power, his lineage. "You will not think of other packs. You will think only of mine." A small, cold smile touched Lily's lips. It was working. She had gotten under his skin. She spent the next 2 days devouring the book. To her surprise, she found it fascinating. It was a brutal, bloody history, but it was also a story of resilience and strength. She read about Wolfe's ancestors, about the founding of his dominion, and about the long, difficult reign of his cruel father. She learned about the pack's traditions, its laws, its strengths, and, more importantly, its weaknesses. The book, meant to be a tool of her indoctrination, was becoming a weapon of her education. On the third day, she tested him again. "Helga," she said, as the woman cleared her breakfast tray, "this history is so interesting. I was reading about the treaty forged by Alpha Wolfe's great-grandfather with the Packs of the Eastern Forest. It was a brilliant piece of diplomacy." She paused, feigning thoughtful consideration.
It seems the Ironclaw Alphas weren't always focused solely on military solutions. It was another carefully aimed dart, a direct comparison between Wolfe and his more diplomatic ancestor, a subtle critique of his own methods, all wrapped in the guise of scholarly interest.
Again, Helga left in a stony silence, and again, Wolfe responded. That afternoon, 2 more books appeared with her lunch tray. One was a detailed text on Ironclaw military strategies. The other was a biography of his father, a man universally known as Wolfe the Terrible. Lily understood his silent, furious retort. You want to talk about strategy? This is our strategy. You want to talk about leadership? This is my legacy. He was doubling down, trying to intimidate her, to browbeat her with the sheer, brutal weight of his power and his bloodline. But he was also engaging with her. He was listening to her whispers and taking the time to answer them. This silent, intellectual battle they were waging through an intermediary was the first real communication they'd had. She was forcing him to see her as more than just a disobedient body to be commanded. She was proving she had a mind, and he, in his own controlling, arrogant way, was acknowledging it. She spent the evening poring over the new books, her mind racing. She was no longer just a prisoner. She was a student of her enemy. She was learning his history, his tactics, his psychology. She was learning the battlefield. Late that night, as she lay curled in the armchair, the book on military strategy open in her lap, she felt a shift in the bond. The low hum of his anger was still there, but it was overlaid with something new, something she hadn't felt from him before, a grudging, unwilling flicker of curiosity. He was watching her, she realized, not just as a possession to be guarded, but as an opponent to be studied. He was trying to understand her, to anticipate her next move. The siege of wills had entered a new, more dangerous phase. It was no longer a simple matter of defiance and punishment. It was a chess match, being played in silence through the pages of books and the whispers passed on by a servant. And Lily, the Omega orphan who was supposed to be a pawn, was learning how to play like a queen. Chapter 10: The Cracks in the Fortress. The silent chess match continued for another week. Lily would make a subtle, carefully worded comment to Helga, and in response, a new book would appear on her tray. She learned about Ironclaw's economic dependencies, their political alliances, and the intricate web of human corporations that Wolfe's old money family controlled. She was an Omega who had never been taught to read anything more complex than a recipe, and now she was absorbing information on geopolitical strategy and corporate finance. The Gilded Cage was becoming her university. Wolfe, for his part, remained a ghost. He never saw him, but his presence was a constant weight at the edge of his senses. He knew, through the bond and through the calculated responses of the books he sent, that her quiet campaign was having an effect. He was intrigued, frustrated, and perhaps, just perhaps, a little impressed. He was trying to shape her, to mold her into a proper Ironclaw mate who understood his world. But in doing so, he was arming her with the very knowledge she would need to challenge it. The fragile stalemate was broken one afternoon by a sound Lily hadn't heard since her arrival, a commotion. Raised voices echoed from the far end of the penthouse, from the direction of Wolfe's office. They were too distant for her to make up the words, but the tone was urgent, angry.
A few minutes later, Helga entered with her lunch tray. For the first time, the woman's stony composure was cracked. Her face was pale. Her hands trembled slightly, and there was a flicker of genuine fear in her eyes. "What's happening?" Lily asked, her voice quiet. Helga pressed her lips together, her ingrained discipline warring with her obvious distress. "It is nothing that concerns you," she said, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. "It concerns the Alpha, doesn't it?" Lily pressed gently.
If he is in trouble, it concerns me. She used the language of the bond, the language of a concerned mate, and saw it land. Helga hesitated, then seemed to crumble under the weight of her worry. "It is the Silvermane Puck," she whispered, her eyes darting toward the door as if expecting Wolfe to appear. "Alpha Alistair, he has made a move. He has seized control of the Kestrel Pass trade route. It is a grave provocation." Lily's mind, now filled with weeks of study, raced. The Kestrel Pass. She had read about it. It was the primary trade route for raw minerals from the northern mountains, not just for the Ironclaw Dominion, but for several other allied pacts. Seizing it wasn't just a challenge to Wolfe. It was a threat to the stability of the entire region. "Wolfe's response will be swift and brutal," Lily murmured, more to herself than Helga. It was the Ironclaw way. An act of aggression was to be met with overwhelming, crushing force. "He is in council with his advisors now," Helga said, wringing her hands. "They are planning the assault." She looked at Lily, a strange, desperate expression on her face. "There will be a war." After Helga left, Lily paced the confines of her suite, her mind a whirlwind of war. It was the inevitable outcome. Wolfe would lead his warriors. He would slaughter the Silvermane wolves, and he would reclaim the pass. He would win. She had no doubt of that. But at what cost? Lives would be lost on both sides. Alliances would be strained. The fragile peace of the continent would be shattered. It was his father's way, the exact same pattern. An attack followed by a disproportionate, brutal retaliation. She thought of the passage in the history book about his great-grandfather, the diplomat. There had to be another way. Driven by an impulse she didn't fully understand, she walked to the table where the books were stacked. She opened the heavy volume on Ironclaw's economic history. She frantically scanned the chapters on trade agreements and human corporate partnerships. Her eyes landed on a section detailing the intricate financial network that underpinned the Kestrel Pass route. The minerals were mined by a Wolfe-owned company, but they were processed and distributed by a network of human corporations, many of whom were heavily indebted to Wolfe's personal financial empire. An idea, audacious and terrifying, began to form in her mind. A plan that had nothing to do with fangs and claws, and everything to do with numbers and leverage. But what could she do? She was a prisoner, a ghost in this penthouse. She had no voice, no power. Wolfe was in his war room, surrounded by his hardened, battle-scarred advisors. They would never listen to the ramblings of a disgraced Omega.
The bond pulsed. Through it, she could feel the cold, lethal focus of Wolfe's mind as he planned his attack. He was in his element, the warrior king, preparing for battle. But beneath the cold focus, she could also feel the immense weight of his responsibility, the crushing pressure of leadership, and something else, a faint, almost imperceptible thread of weariness, the weariness of a man who had been fighting his entire life. She had to try. She couldn't stand by and do nothing while he walked the same bloody path his father had. She had no way to speak to him directly, but she had an intermediary. When Helga came to collect the untouched lunch tray an hour later, Lily was waiting for her. She held out the open book on economic history. "Helga," she said, her voice calm and steady, "please, you must do something for me. You must take this to the Alpha." She pointed to a specific paragraph on the page. "And you must tell him. Tell him to look at the shipping manifests for the last 6 months. Tell him the weakness isn't in the pass. It's in the quarterly earnings report of Sterling Vance Logistics." Helga stared at her, her face a mask of confusion and disbelief. I cannot interrupt the War Council. The Alpha would have my head." "Please," Lily insisted, her eyes boring into the older woman's eyes. "You said it yourself. There will be a war. Lives are at stake. This might be a way to prevent that. Just give him the message. That's all I ask." The fear in Helga's eyes was profound.
But as she looked at the young woman before her, no longer a defiant girl, but a serious, focused strategist, she saw something that made her hesitate. With a trembling hand, she took the heavy book. I will try," she whispered, before turning and hurrying from the room. Lily was left alone, her heart pounding in her chest. She had just rolled the dice. She had either just signed her own death warrant for her audacity, or she had, for the first time, truly entered the game. Chapter 11. The Counsel of a Trusted Man. The war room was a sanctum of masculine power. The air was thick with the scent of leather, old maps, and the faint, metallic tang of aggression. A massive, intricately carved oak table dominated the center of the room, its surface covered with topographical maps of the Northern Territories. Alpha Wolfe stood at its head, a grim, commanding figure, his presence sucking the very oxygen from the air. His top advisors, a collection of battle-hardened, gray-muzzled wolves, were arrayed around him, their faces set in hard, determined lines. "Alpha Alistar has overplayed his hand," growled a scarred warrior named Marcus, jabbing a thick finger at the map. "His warriors are strong, but they are not prepared for a full-scale assault. We can be at the mouth of the Kestrel Pass by moonrise tomorrow. We hit them hard, we hit them fast. We make an example of them." A chorus of gruff agreement went around the table. This was the language they understood, the logic of overwhelming force. Wolfe nodded, his stormy eyes fixed on the map, his mind already moving pieces on the battlefield. "Mobilize the northern garrisons," he commanded, his voice a low, lethal rumble. "I want a full tactical report on my desk within the hour. We will crush this rebellion before it has a chance to take root."
But even as he spoke the words, a strange sense of unease settled in the pit of his stomach. This was the path he had always walked, the path his father had carved for him. It was simple, direct, and brutal. Yet for the first time, it felt incomplete. The echo of Lily's quiet, defiant words lingered in his mind. It seems the Ironclaw Alphas weren't always focused solely on military solutions. It was at that moment that a soft, hesitant knock came at the heavy oak doors. Every head in the room turned, annoyance and surprise on their faces. The War Council was sacrosanct. It was never to be interrupted. The door creaked open, and the maid, Helga, scurried in, her head bowed, her body trembling with terror. She held a heavy leather-bound book clutched to her chest like a shield. "What is the meaning of this?" Marcus snarled, rising slightly from his chair. Helga flinched, but did not look at him. Her eyes were fixed on the floor in front of her Alpha. "My lord," she whispered, her voice shaking. "A message. From her." A dangerous silence fell over the room. Her. There was only one her who would have the audacity. Wolfe's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. His first instinct was to rage, to punish this insubordination, this ridiculous feminine intrusion into the world of men and war. But Kellen, his oldest and most trusted advisor, a calm, thoughtful Wolfe who had also served his father, held up a placating hand. "Let the woman speak, my lord," he said, his voice a soothing counterpoint to the aggressive tension in the room. Wolfe gave a curt, angry nod. "Speak," he commanded Helga. She said to give you this, my lord," the maid stammered, shuffling forward and placing the open book on the edge of the table. Her finger, trembling, pointed to a paragraph. "And she said to tell you to look at the shipping manifests for the last 6 months. She said the weakness isn't in the pass. It's in the quarterly earnings report of Sterling Vance Logistics." Having delivered her message, Helga bowed low and practically ran from the room, pulling the doors shut behind her. A wave of confused, contemptuous muttering went around the table.
Shipping manifests? What is this nonsense? Marcus scoffed. The girl is playing games. She should be punished for this interruption. Wolfe ignored them. His gaze was fixed on the open book. He recognized it. It was one of the volumes he had sent her, a dry, dense text on economic history. His eyes scanned the paragraph her finger had indicated. It detailed the complex financial structures underpinning the mineral trade. Sterling-Vance Logistics was the primary human corporation responsible for transport. His mind, sharp and analytical, began to connect the dots. The name was familiar. He pulled a file from a stack on a nearby credenza, his movements sharp and precise. He flipped it open. There it was, Sterling-Vance Logistics, one of the many corporations in which he held a majority stake through a series of shell companies. A fact so minor in the grand scheme of his vast financial empire that he had forgotten it.
He looked at the shipping manifests. Then he pulled up the company's recent earnings reports on a tablet. He saw the anomaly immediately, a subtle but undeniable pattern of shipping discrepancies, of rerouted cargo, of falsified numbers. Alistair hadn't just seized the past with force. He had been bleeding him dry for months, working from the inside, exploiting the financial vulnerability Wolfe hadn't even known existed. A full frontal military assault would have been exactly what Alistair expected. It would have been a bloody, costly war fought on Alistair's terms, while the true wound continued to hemorrhage money and resources. She had seen it. The Omega girl, locked in her tower with nothing but a pile of books, had seen the one thing he and all his seasoned warriors had missed. "My lord?" Marcus prompted, his voice laced with impatience. Wolfe looked up from the tablet, his face a mask of cold, unreadable contemplation. He felt a dizzying, unsettling mix of emotions. Fury at his own oversight, shock at her incredible insight, and a grudging, profound sense of respect. "The assault is on hold," he said, his voice flat. The room erupted in protest. "But my lord, we must show strength." Silence. Wolfe's command was a whip crack of pure alpha power that instantly silenced every voice. He turned his gaze to Kaelin, who was watching him with wise, knowing eyes. "Kaelin," Wolfe said, "assemble the financial team. I want to acquire all outstanding debt for every board member of Sterling-Vance Logistics, and I want to call an emergency shareholder meeting. It appears we are about to engage in a hostile takeover." He looked around the table at his stunned, confused advisors. The war will not be fought in the past. It will be fought in a boardroom, and we will not shed a drop of blood. Later that night, after the shocked war council had been dismissed, Wolfe stood alone with Kaelin in the now quiet room. "She saw it," Wolfe said in a low murmur of disbelief. "I sent her those books to control her, to indoctrinate her. Instead, she weaponized them." Kaelin nodded, a small, wise smile on his face. "You brought the storm into your own house, my lord. You should not be surprised that it rains." Pause. His gaze steady. "For years, you have been surrounded by warriors who think as you do. Perhaps it is time you started listening to someone who doesn't, not as a mate to be placated, but as an outsider with fresh eyes." Wolfe stared at the map, at the Kestrel Pass, the place where he had been moments away from sending hundreds of his wolves to die. He had been playing checkers, a simple game of force and capture. She, with no training, no experience, was playing chess, and she had just saved his kingdom from a costly, bloody mistake. The fortress of his pride, the one built on the foundations of his father's cruel lessons, had just sustained a direct hit. And for the first time, he realized he didn't want to rebuild the wall. He wanted to see what was on the other side. Chapter 12. The Summons to the Sanctum.
The next 24 hours were a blur of silent, intense activity. Instead of warriors sharpening their claws, it was Wolfe's team of human lawyers and financiers, a pack of a different sort, who went to war. They moved with the silent, lethal efficiency of sharks, buying up debt, leveraging assets, and preparing for the corporate kill.
Wolfe was in his element, a different kind of battlefield, but one where he was just as dominant. The military assault on Kestrel Pass was officially canceled, replaced by a financial siege that Alpha Alistair would never see coming. Through it all, Lily remained in her gilded cage, a ghost in the machine she had set in motion. She had no idea if her message had been received with fury or consideration. Helga was as silent and stony as ever, her face betraying nothing. The silence from Wolfe was absolute. For all Lily knew, he was planning a war on two fronts, one against the Silvermane pack, and one against her for her insubordination. The uncertainty was a slow, gnawing torture. She had reread the passage in the economics book 100 times, tracing the complex web of corporations and trade routes with her finger. Her logic seemed sound, but she was an amateur, an omega, with no formal education. What if she was wrong? What if her desperate gambit was nothing more than the naive fantasy of a girl who had read too many books? The thought that her interference could lead to even greater disaster was a heavy weight on her soul. Late the following evening, as she sat staring out at the indifferent city lights, the doors to her suite opened. It wasn't Helga, it was Kaelin, Wolfe's trusted advisor. He was an older Wolfe, his gray streaked hair tied back in a neat tail, his face lined with the wisdom of many years. His eyes, unlike those of the other aggressive warriors she had glimpsed, were calm and thoughtful. He bowed his head slightly, a gesture of respect that so startled her she almost fell out of her chair. "Miss Lily," he said, his voice a calm, deep baritone. "The Alpha requests your presence in the war room." Lily's heart stopped, then started again with a painful, frantic thud. The war room, the inner sanctum, the place where no woman, let alone an Omega servant in a gray uniform, had ever been permitted to set foot. This was it, the moment of her judgment. Her hands trembled as she stood. "Am I in trouble?" she asked, her voice a small, reedy thing. A flicker of a smile touched Kaelin's lips. "That, I believe, is yet to be determined. He is intrigued. Please, come with me." She followed him down the long, echoing corridor, her simple servant slippers making no sound on the polished marble floor. Her mind was a chaotic jumble of fear and a strange, defiant spark of anticipation. He was going to listen, or he was going to execute her. At this point, either seemed equally plausible. Kaelin pushed open the heavy oak doors to the war room, and Lily stepped inside. The air was thick with power, the scent of old leather, paper, and the aggressive masculine scent of the wolves who had been arguing within its walls for days. The room was dominated by the massive table she had seen in her mind's eye, its surface covered with maps and files. Wolfe was there, standing at the head of the table, looking at a map. His advisors, the same group of hard-faced, intimidating warriors, were seated around it. As one, they all turned to look at her as she entered. Their expressions ranged from shock to open, contemptuous hostility. She could feel the weight of their disapproval, a physical force pressing down on her. She, an Omega, a girl, a servant, was defiling their sacred space. She stopped just inside the doorway, feeling small and utterly out of place in her drab gray uniform. She clutched her hands together to stop them from shaking, lifted her chin, and met their hostile stares. Wolfe finally looked up. His stormy gaze swept over her, taking in her plain attire, her pale face, her defiant posture. His expression was unreadable, a mask of cold, hard control. "Come here," he said,
his voice flat. He pointed to a spot on the map on the table. Lily's legs felt like lead, but she forced them to move. She walked the long distance to the head of the table, acutely aware of every hostile eye tracking her progress. She stopped beside him, her gaze falling to the map. It was a detailed topographical map of the Kestrel Pass and the surrounding territories. "Explain," Wolfe commanded, his voice low enough that only she could hear it. "You said the weakness was not here," his finger tapped the pass, "but in a financial report. Explain your reasoning, to all of us." This was her test. He wasn't just asking for her opinion. He was demanding she defend it in front of a council of wolves who already despised her. Her throat went dry. She could feel Marcus's glare burning into the side of her face. She took a deep breath, the scent of the room, his scent, filling her lungs, steadying her. She had studied, she had learned, she knew this. An assault on the pass would be a direct military confrontation. It would be costly in both lives and resources, and it would be what Alpha Alistar expects. It is a trap. "A trap?" Marcus scoffed from down the table. "We are the Iron Claw Legion. We do not fall into traps. We smash them." Lily ignored him, keeping her eyes fixed on the map, on Wolfe. "He wants you to attack. He wants a bloody public war. It would make you look like a warmonger, like your father. It would strain your alliances with the other packs who rely on that trade route. While you are busy fighting a glorious, bloody battle in the mountains, he would continue to exploit the real weakness, the one you can't see." She took another breath, gathering her courage. He had compromised Sterling Vance logistics. For months, he has been using them to siphon resources, to falsify shipments. He isn't just trying to control the pass, he's trying to bankrupt the entire northern trade network, to make your allies desperate and turn them against you. He's not fighting a war of territory, he's fighting a war of economics, and he was winning because you were preparing to fight the wrong battle. A heavy, stunned silence fell over the room. The advisors stared at her, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and a dawning, grudging understanding. She hadn't spoken of pack politics or warrior's honor. She had spoken of logistics, economics, and long-term strategy, a language they rarely considered, but one that resonated with cold, hard logic. Lily finished, her heart pounding, her speech leaving her breathless. She had laid her theory bare. She had challenged their entire way of thinking. She had done all she could. She lifted her eyes from the map and finally, directly, met Wolfe's gaze.
He was staring at her, and for the first time the mask was gone. In his stormy eyes she saw no anger, no suspicion, no cold command. She saw only a raw, unadulterated, and utterly profound sense of awe. Chapter 13. The Omega's Gambit. The awe in Wolfe's eyes lasted only for a fraction of a second before the mask of the impassive Alpha Lord slammed back into place. But Lily had seen it, and it was enough. It was a single spark of light in the suffocating darkness of the war room. The silence that followed her explanation was thick with the weight of shattered assumptions. The advisors looked from her to their Alpha, their faces a complex mixture of shock, skepticism, and a reluctant, dawning respect. She had walked into their sanctum, a place of pure, aggressive, masculine power, and she had dismantled their entire strategy with quiet logic. It was Marcus, the scarred, aggressive warrior, who broke the silence. His voice was a low, incredulous growl. "Economics? We are wolves. We are warriors. We do not win our battles in the ledgers of human corporations. We win them with fang and claw. This is dishonorable, a coward's tactic." "There is no honor in walking into a trap," Lily replied, her voice steady. She didn't look at Marcus. She kept her gaze fixed on Wolfe. He was the only one who mattered. There is no honor in sending your warriors to die for a piece of land when the real war is being fought elsewhere. The most honorable victory is the one won with the fewest lives lost." "She is right," Kalen said, his calm voice cutting through the rising tension. He looked around the table at his fellow advisors, their faces a complex mixture of shock, skepticism, and a reluctant, dawning respect. She had walked into their sanctum, a place of pure, aggressive masculine power, and she had dismantled their entire strategy with quiet logic. It was Marcus, the scarred, aggressive warrior, who sneered. "So what is your proposal, girl? That we send a sternly worded letter to their accountants?" A few of the other advisors chuckled darkly. They were still resisting, their pride wounded by the fact that an Omega servant had seen what they hadn't. It was then that Lily laid out her gambit. The idea had been a half-formed theory, but now, standing here in the heart of power, it solidified into a concrete, audacious plan. "No," she said, her voice ringing with a newfound confidence. "You don't send a letter. You don't ask, and you don't negotiate. You take." She looked directly at Wolfe. "You told me you inherited a kingdom on the brink of collapse. You told me you spent 15 years fighting to hold it together, but you didn't just fight with your warriors. You built a financial empire." She gestured to the files on the credenza. "You own companies, you control markets, you wield a power that Alpha Alistair with all his warriors cannot comprehend. He is playing in your world now, and in that world, you are the apex predator." She could feel the shift in the room. The advisors had stopped muttering. They were listening. "Don't attack the Kestrel Pass," she continued, her mind racing, the plan unfolding with a startling clarity.
Let him keep it, for now. Let him think his deception is working. Instead, you launch a different kind of assault. You use your vast financial resources to quietly buy up the controlling interest in Sterling Vance Logistics. You already own a majority stake. Acquiring the rest would be simple. At the same time, you identify the Silvermane Pact's key human business partners, the companies that supply their technology, their fuel, their refined goods. You acquire their debt. You leverage their weaknesses. You cut off their supply lines not in the mountains, but on the stock market. Her voice grew stronger, more passionate. You choke him. You cut off his access to the human world. You make it impossible for him to pay his warriors, to feed his people, to fuel his ambitions. You don't destroy his army. You make it impossible for him to field one. You bring his entire dominion to its knees without shedding a single drop of blood. And then, when he is weak, when he is desperate, then you send him a message, not a declaration of war, an invitation to negotiate his surrender." She finished, her chest heaving, the audacity of her own plan leaving her breathless. It was a queen's gambit, a strategic sacrifice of a minor piece, temporary control of the pass, to achieve an unassailable strategic position. The war room was utterly, profoundly silent. The advisors stared at her, their faces slack with shock. They were men who understood battlefields of rock and soil. She had just described a battlefield of stocks, debt, and corporate law. It was a foreign, terrifying, and undeniably brilliant strategy. Marcus looked like he had been slapped. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, unable to form a coherent objection. All eyes turned to Wolfe. He had remained silent throughout her speech, his face an unreadable mask of stone. He was staring at her, his stormy eyes glowing with intensity that was almost frightening. He was looking at her not as a prisoner, not as an Omega, not even as his mate. He was looking at her as a fellow predator, a strategist whose mind was as sharp and as lethal as his own. The internal war in his eyes was visible,
Everything his father had ever taught him, every instinct he had ever honed, screamed for a direct, violent confrontation, to answer a challenge with overwhelming force, to meet a threat with blood and steel. Lily's plan was the antithesis of his entire being. It was subtle, patient, and fought in the shadows of the human world he secretly disdained. To agree to her plan would be more than just a strategic shift. It would be an admission that his way, his father's way, was no longer the only way. It would be an act of trust, not just in her, but in a new kind of power. He walked slowly around the table until he stood directly in front of her. The room held its collective breath. He was so close she could see the flecks of silver in his gray eyes. "You are suggesting," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble, "that I entrust the security of my entire dominion to a strategy of accounting?" "I am suggesting," she replied, her voice not wavering, "that you win the war before the first battle is ever fought." He stared at her for a heart-stopping eternity. The future of the Dominion and the future of their relationship hung in the balance of this single moment.
Then he turned to face his stunned advisors. A slow, dangerous smile spread across his lips. It was the first genuine smile she had ever seen from him. It was terrifying. And it was beautiful. "Do it," he commanded, his voice ringing with the absolute authority of the Alpha Lord. "Do exactly as she said." Chapter 14. The Checkmate. The aftermath of the War Council was a seismic shift in the penthouse's atmosphere. The advisors, humbled and a little bit terrified, now looked at Lily with a new, grudging respect. Marcus, the most vocal of her detractors, wouldn't meet her eye, but his hostility had been replaced by a quiet, bewildered awe. Lily was no longer asked to leave the war room. In fact, Wolfe silently decreed her presence was required. She was no longer a servant in a gray uniform, but a strategist in quiet counsel. The days that followed were a masterclass in silent, invisible warfare. Wolfe's financial teams moved with ruthless precision. Following the blueprint Lily had laid out, they executed a series of maneuvers in the human corporate world that were as devastating as any military assault. They acquired the remaining shares of Sterling Vance Logistics in a single, brutal morning of trading. They bought up the outstanding debt of 3 key companies that supplied the Silver Main Pack with everything from refined fuel to medical supplies. They did it all through a web of shell corporations and third-party brokers, leaving Alpha Alistar completely blind to the economic noose that was tightening around his neck. Lily sat in the war room watching the reports come in on a large screen. She was a quiet, still presence in a room buzzing with the energy of Wolfe's commands. He didn't ask for her input again, but he would occasionally glance at her, a silent question in his eyes, and she would give a small, subtle nod of encouragement. They were partners, communicating in a silent language of strategy and shared purpose. The bond between them had changed. The constant, low-level thrum of his anger and possessiveness had been replaced by a powerful, steady current of respect and a deep, humming curiosity. He was fascinated by her, by the mind that worked so differently from his own. He was beginning to see her not as a problem to be solved or a possession to be controlled, but as his single greatest asset. Exactly 1 week after the council, the first report of the plan's success arrived. An informant in the Silvermane territory reported that a major shipment of fuel had been indefinitely delayed, citing unforeseen supply chain issues. 2 days later, a vital delivery of medical supplies was rerouted due to a sudden corporate restructuring. Alpha Alistar, still proudly occupying the Kestrel Pass, was beginning to feel the squeeze. His warriors could hold the mountain pass, but they couldn't fight an enemy they couldn't see. The checkmate came 10 days after Lily's gambit had been put into motion. Kalen entered the war room, a rare, triumphant smile on his face. He said, "My lord," his voice ringing with satisfaction. "We have just received a message from Alpha Alistar. He requests an urgent meeting to discuss mutual economic interests."
He has also withdrawn all his warriors from the Kestrel Pass."
A wave of relieved, exultant laughter went around the room. The advisors, who had been so skeptical, were now looking at Lily with open admiration. They had won. They had achieved a total, humiliating victory over a dangerous rival, and not a single Ironclaw warrior had even had to leave the barracks. Wolfe stood at the head of the table, his face impassive, but Lily could feel his triumph through the bond, a powerful, heady surge of satisfaction and pride. He dismissed his advisors, leaving him and Lily alone in the quiet, map-strewn room. He walked slowly around the table until he stood before her. The power dynamic between them, once a brutal vertical line with him at the top and her at the bottom, had been completely redrawn. They were two poles of a new kind of power. "You were right," he said, his voice a low, gravelly admission. "You won this, Lily, not me." The admission was a profound one, something she knew he had never said to anyone in his life. It was a greater victory than the surrender of Alpha Alistair. "We won it," she corrected softly. "Your power and resources made it possible." "My resources were a sword I was about to stupidly plunge into a mountain," he countered, a hint of self-deprecating humor in his tone that she had never heard before. "You showed me where the real battle was. You showed me a different kind of strength." He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek. His touch was no longer possessive, but questioning, tentative. It sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated electricity through her. "My father taught me that a mate was a weakness, a liability. He was wrong. You are the most dangerous weapon in my entire arsenal." "I am not your weapon, Wolfe," she said, her voice quiet but firm, holding his gaze. He held her look for a long moment. Then a slow, genuine smile touched his lips. It transformed his harsh, handsome face, making him look younger, less burdened. "No," he agreed, his thumb gently stroking her skin. He paused, and the intensity in his stormy eyes took her breath away. "You are my queen." The words hung in the air between them, a declaration that was also a surrender. He was ceding a part of his power, his authority, his very identity to her, not because a goddess had commanded it, but because she had earned it. She had met him on the battlefield of wits and strategy and had emerged his equal. The bond between them flared, but this time it was not a storm of anger or a chain of possession. It was a bright, warm, and terrifyingly powerful current of mutual respect, admiration, and the dawning, undeniable stirring of something that felt dangerously like love. The external threat was neutralized, but the internal landscape of their relationship had been completely, irrevocably redrawn. He was beginning to see her not just as his fated mate, but as his partner, his queen. And this realization, Lily knew, was both the end of one war and the beginning of a new, far more complicated and exhilarating journey, the journey of learning to rule and to love together. Chapter 15. The Queen's First Decree. The victory over Alpha Alistair, silent and bloodless as it was, echoed through the Ironclaw Dominion with the force of a thunderclap. It was a victory of intellect over instinct, of strategy over savagery, and it fundamentally altered the perception of power within the pack. The penthouse, once the symbol of Lily's gilded imprisonment, transformed into the nerve center of a quiet revolution. The advisors, hardened warriors who had spent their lives measuring strength in torn flesh and broken bones, now looked upon Lily with a new, profound, and deeply unsettling respect. She was not merely the Alpha's mate, an Omega who had gotten lucky. She was an architect of power, a strategist who saw battlefields they didn't even know existed. The morning after Alistair's official and humiliating request for negotiation, Lily awoke in her suite not to the rough, scratchy feel of her gray servant's uniform, but to the whisper of silk against her skin. She had fallen asleep in the armchair in her suite, a habit born of defiance that she had yet to break. But sometime during the night, someone had gently covered her with a cashmere blanket. On the table beside her, where Helga usually left a simple tray, sat a single, perfect white rose in a crystal vase. Beside it was a note, written in Wolfe's strong, angular script. The ink was bold, the words simple, yet they struck her with the force of a physical blow. My queen. Tears pricked her eyes. This was not a command. It was a concession, an acknowledgement, a restoration of the dignity he had stripped from her. It was, in its own way, an apology. With trembling fingers, she picked up the rose, its scent filling the sterile air with a life and beauty that had long been absent. Later that morning, she found the heap of her discarded designer clothes had vanished from the closet floor. In their place, the entire wardrobe had been meticulously cleaned, pressed, and rehung as if the Cold War and her demotion to a servant had been nothing more than a bad dream. The summons came in the afternoon. It was Kaelin who delivered it, with a deep, respectful bow that no longer was startling, but felt appropriate. Wolfe was requesting her presence not in his office or the war room, but in the vast, formal sitting room, a space reserved for the most important of councils. When she arrived, she found his entire advisory council already assembled. The stern, battle-scarred faces of Marcus and the others were there, all standing stiffly, their expressions a mixture of humility and apprehension. As she entered the room, every single one of them, these powerful, dominant wolves, rose to their feet. Wolfe stood before the grand fireplace, the flames reflecting in the polished marble floor. He was dressed not in a warrior's leathers or a corporate suit, but in the formal, dark tunic of the Alpha Lord. He watched her cross the room, his stormy eyes clear and serious. He had not just called a meeting, he had convened a court. "The Dominion owes you a debt of gratitude, Lily," he announced, his voice ringing with the authority that silenced the very air. He did not speak to her as his mate, but as a leader addressing another leader. Your strategy, your foresight, saved this pack from a costly and unnecessary war. It has secured our northern border and financial interests for a generation to come. Your counsel is no longer a suggestion to be considered. It is a pillar upon which the future of this leadership will be built.
He gestured to a large, ornate chair, carved from dark, ancient wood that had been placed directly beside his own at the head of the room. It was not the seat of a consort, slightly behind and to the side. It was a throne, a seat of equal power. Your place is here, by my side, as my equal. Lily's heart pounded, a heavy, steady drum against her ribs. This was more than she could have imagined. He wasn't just restoring her status, he was elevating it, cementing it in front of the very men who had scorned her. She walked to the chair, her back straight, her chin held high, and sat. The symbolism was lost on no one. "Now," Wolfe said, turning his attention back to the council, his tone shifting to business. "We have the matter of the spoils. The hostile takeover of Sterling Vance Logistics has been completed. The assets and debts we acquired from the Silvermane's now defunct human partners have yielded a significant financial surplus. We must decide how to best utilize these new resources." Marcus, ever the warrior, cleared his throat. He had been humbled, but his instincts were deeply ingrained. "A fund to strengthen our border garrisons, my lord," he suggested, his voice gruff, "and a victory bonus for every warrior who stood ready for the call to arms, a show of strength and appreciation." This was her moment, her first test, not as a hidden advisor, but as a public leader. She could feel Wolfe's eyes on her, a silent transfer of power. The floor was hers. "No," Lily said. Her voice was quiet, yet it cut through the room with the clarity of a bell.
every head swiveled in her direction. A portion of the funds will be used to reinforce our defenses, of course. That is prudent. But the majority will be used for something else entirely. She felt the weight of their collective stare. She could feel Wolfe beside her, a solid, unwavering presence. She knew this was a test of his trust as much as her leadership. Alpha Alistair's aggression was not enacted in a vacuum. His blockade of the Kestrel Pass disrupted trade for a dozen smaller neutral pacts in the region. Their people have suffered shortages because of his ambition and our subsequent conflict. We will not use our victory to simply hoard more wealth or sharpen more swords. We will use it to demonstrate a new kind of power, a new definition of strength. She rose from her throne, her hands resting on the ornate arms of the chair. I propose we create the Iron Claw Prosperity Fund. We will use the surplus from this victory to offer immediate, no-strings-attached relief to the pacts who were harmed. Food, medical supplies, infrastructure grants. Furthermore, we will offer them new, far more favorable trade agreements, backed by our now unchallenged financial strength. For generations, this dominion has ruled through fear. Our neighbors and allies obey us because they know the consequences of defiance. I propose we give them a new reason to stand with us. We will bind them to us, not with fear, but with loyalty. We will prove to the entire continent that an alliance with the Ironclaw is a guarantee of security and prosperity. We will turn the spoils of a potential war into the seeds of a lasting peace.
The proposal was breathtakingly radical. It was a complete repudiation of the Ironclaw way, which had always been to take spoils, punish the weak, and hoard power. She was suggesting they give their winnings away, that they invest in their neighbors rather than dominate them. Marcus looked aghast, his face flushing a deep red. "But, my queen," he stammered, the new title feeling clumsy on his tongue. "That is our wealth. We earned it with our strategy." "Did we?" Lily challenged, her gaze sharp and unwavering, meeting his eyes directly. "Or did we simply have the power and the leverage to take it? There is a profound difference. One builds an empire on a foundation of resentment, constantly fighting to suppress rebellion. The other builds a legacy on a foundation of mutual respect, surrounded by allies who protect you because your survival is integral to their own. Which foundation do you believe is stronger?" The room was plunged into a stunned silence. Every advisor, every hardened warrior looked to Wolfe. They were waiting for him to shut down this insane, compassionate, and, frankly, terrifying notion. The fate of her first decree, her first official act as their queen, rested entirely on his response. Wolfe was silent for a long, agonizing moment. Lily could feel the hurricane of his internal struggle through the bond, the pull of his father's lessons, of a lifetime of tradition, of the brutal logic of force, all warring against this new, sunlit path she was illuminating for him. It was the hardest choice of his life played out on a public stage. Finally, he rose to stand beside her. His voice when he spoke was a low, decisive rumble that seemed to shake the very stones of the hall. "Her Majesty is right." The use of her new title was a deliberate, powerful affirmation. He was not just agreeing with her, he was cementing her authority. For generations, we have ruled through the fist. Our neighbors fear us, but they do not trust us. Our alliances are brittled, based on the principle that we are the biggest wolf in the forest. That changes today. He looked at Marcus, his eyes like chips of granite, leaving no room for argument. Strength is not just about the ability to crush your enemies. It is also about the wisdom to turn them into allies. The Prosperity Fund will be established immediately. The relief convoys will depart by weekend. This is Queen Lily's first royal decree, and you will all see to its execution swiftly and without question. His public, unequivocal support was her shield and her sword. It protected her from their dissent and cut down any who would dare to challenge her authority. He had been tested, and he had not faltered.
He had chosen her way, their way, over the bloody path of his ancestors. As the dazed council was dismissed to carry out her orders, a new and complex political reality began to settle over the Dominion. Lily was no longer just the Alpha's mate. She was a true power, a co-ruler, a force of radical change with the full, unwavering backing of the most feared Alpha on the continent. But as she and Wolfe stood alone in the quiet, sun-drenched room, she knew that their victory was far from complete.
They had won a war, and they had won over his council. But changing the very soul of a dominion built on a century of fear would be a much longer and much more dangerous battle. Chapter 16. The Ghosts of the Past. The establishment of the Iron Claw Prosperity Fund sent shockwaves that radiated far beyond the Dominion's borders. The smaller pacts, accustomed to being treated as vassals or pawns by the great powers, reacted first with disbelief, then with a cautious dawning hope. Delegations began to arrive at the glass tower, not with a fearful, head-bowed deference of the past, but with a new curiosity. Lily, with Wolfe always a silent, supportive presence at her side, met with them all. She discovered a natural talent for diplomacy. Her quiet empathy, combined with the sharp analytical mind she had honed on his books, allowing her to win over even the most skeptical of the minor alphas. She didn't make demands, she listened. She didn't issue threats, she offered solutions. The Dominion was changing from the outside in. Under their dual leadership, a new era of stability and shared prosperity seemed not just possible but inevitable. However, a kingdom built on a century of blood and fear does not change its nature overnight. The old ways had deep, tangled roots, and those roots, deprived of the sunlight of open conflict, began to stir and fester in the shadows. The first sign of trouble was a rumor, a poison whispered in the barracks, in the old halls of the ancestral manor, and in the taverns where the warriors gathered. It was a subtle, insidious poison, a dart aimed not at Wolfe, whose power was still too absolute to challenge directly, but at the perceived source of his change, Lily. She has weakened him. Our Alpha is ruled by his Omega mate. He gives away our wealth, the spoils of our strength, to our enemies. This is not the Iron Claw way. The old Lord would be turning in his grave. Wolfe, whose network of informants was as vast and efficient as his financial empire, heard the news almost immediately. He brought the news to Lily one evening, as they sat in the quiet of the penthouse, his face a grim, furious mask. "It is Thane," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl that vibrated with contained violence, "and his loyalists, the Old Guard." Lily's mind, now a repository of Ironclaw history and politics, immediately placed the name and the threat he represented. Thane was one of the oldest, most respected, and most feared warriors in the Dominion. He had been one of his father's most brutal and effective lieutenants, a true believer in the philosophy of rule through absolute, merciless strength. He was not just a dissenter, he was a living relic of the old regime. "He sees you as a sickness," Wolfe continued, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides, a battle to control the violent rage that boiled within him. "He sees you as the living embodiment of the weakness my father warned me against my entire life. He believes you have bewitched me, turned me soft. He and his followers are spreading dissent among the more traditionalist factions, trying to convince them that I have betrayed our heritage."
"What will you do?" Lily asked, her heart sinking. This was a threat from within, the most insidious and dangerous kind of all. An external enemy could be fought, but this was a cancer in the heart of their own pack. The old wolf, the warrior king she had first met, would have dragged Thane into the public square and executed him for treason without a second thought. But the man standing before her now was different, and she could see the agonizing conflict warring in his eyes. "The old way, my father's way, would be to crush him," Wolfe said, his voice tight with the strain of his control. "To make a public, bloody example of him and anyone who stands with him. But that," he looked at her, his expression pained, "that would only prove his point. It would be an act of the very tyranny we are trying to leave behind. It would make him a martyr to the old ways. It would ignite a civil war." "So what is the new way?" she asked softly, her heart aching for the impossible position he was in. He ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture of profound frustration and weariness. "I don't know," he admitted, and the raw honesty of that admission was a testament to how profoundly he had changed. "He is not an external enemy like Alistair. I can't defeat him in a boardroom. He is a part of the very soul of this dominion, the old, violent, honorable part that so many still cling to. To fight him is to fight our own history, our own identity." The threat was more than just political. It was deeply, agonizingly personal for Wolfe. Thane and his faction were not just challenging Lily's policies. They were challenging Wolfe's very transformation. They were the ghosts of his father, rising from the grave to condemn him for his betrayal of their brutal, masculine creed. Every move he made with Lily, every step he took toward a more diplomatic and prosperous rule was, in their eyes, a step toward the very weakness that had gotten his mother killed. This was the core of their argument, the emotional heart of their rebellion, and it was a wound in Wolfe that had never truly healed. The pressure began to mount, subtly but relentlessly. A shipment of grain meant for the Prosperity Fund was sabotaged, the entire convoy found spoiled, making it look like Ironclaw's promises were empty and incompetent. A minor border dispute with a neighboring pack, which Lily had been patiently negotiating toward a peaceful resolution, suddenly escalated into a violent skirmish, with evidence later proven to be skillfully fabricated, suggesting that Ironclaw warriors had initiated the unprovoked attack. Thane was a master of shadow warfare, using rumors, deception, and plausible deniability to undermine their new rule, always careful to leave no direct proof of his involvement. He was making them look weak and foolish, validating his own grim prophecies. One night, weeks into this silent, grinding insurgency, Lily found Wolfe standing alone on the balcony, staring out at the distant, dark mountains, his broad shoulders slumped with a weariness that seemed to go bone deep. He looked smaller than she had ever seen him, a giant weighed down by invisible ghosts.
"He is my father's ghost, Lily," he said without turning, his voice heavy with a pain he had never allowed himself to show before. "Every argument Dane makes is one my father beat into me as a child. Every accusation he levels, that I am weak, that I am ruled by emotion, is a fear I have carried in my own heart my entire life. In my head, I know he is wrong. I know your way is better, but he represents the foundation upon which this entire dominion was built. To tear him down, it feels like tearing down the whole house, the very bones of who we are." Lily came to stand beside him, her presence a quiet, steady comfort in the vast, lonely darkness. She didn't touch him, but stood shoulder to shoulder, a partner facing the storm with him, that connection a silent, supportive current through the bond. "Then we don't tear the house down," she said, her voice firm and clear, a beacon in his sea of doubt. "We renovate it. We honor the strong foundations, but we knock down the walls and let in the light. We have to prove to them, and to yourself, that our way isn't weaker, but a different, more resilient kind of strength." He finally looked at her, his stormy eyes filled with a raw vulnerability that stole her breath. The love he felt for her, a love he had once seen as his greatest weakness, was now his only source of strength against the haunting specters of his past. "How?" he asked, the single word not a demand, but a genuine, desperate plea. "How do we fight shadows?" "We don't," she said, her gaze clear and unwavering, meeting his without flinching. "We shine a light so bright that there are no shadows left for them to hide in." He was being haunted by the legacy of his father, a legacy of fear and control. Thane and his loyalists were the living embodiment of that legacy, a constant whispering reminder of the man he used to be. This was not a battle for territory or for resources. This was a battle for Wolfe's soul, for his future, and for the very identity of the entire Ironclaw dominion. And it was a battle they would have to win, not with force, but with a kind of courage and intelligence that neither of them had ever been tested with before. Chapter 17, A Conspiracy of Shadows. Lily's plan to shine a light on the shadows began not in the grand war room, but in the quiet, unseen corners of the penthouse.
while Wolfe and his official council were mired and reacting to the overt political fallout from Thane's sabotage, repairing diplomatic relations, sending out replacement shipments, and trying to track down concrete evidence that always seemed to evaporate, Lily began to build her own quieter network of intelligence. She was still seen by many of the old guard as the Omega mate, an outsider, a soft-hearted liability. But to the servants, the maids, the cooks, the overlooked and invisible people who kept the glass tower running, she was something else entirely. She was one of their own who had risen, and she had never forgotten where she came from. Her shadow council began with Helga. The stern older woman had been transformed by the events of the Kestrel Pass incident. Her absolute loyalty to Wolfe was now matched by a fierce, almost fanatical protective respect for Lily. She became Lily's eyes and ears among the household staff.
"They speak when they think no one of importance is listening," Helga told Lily one afternoon, her hands busy polishing a silver tray while her mind was clearly elsewhere. They were in the main kitchen, a bustling, steamy place that had become Lily's new information hub. They call you the Omega Queen, but it's a sneer, not a title. They say you are a witch who has softened the Alpha's mind, that you practice some kind of magic to make him weak. Lily listened patiently, absorbing every detail, piecing together the fragments of information. This was the nature of Thane's conspiracy. It was built on whispers, on preying on the superstitions and deep-seated fears of the traditionalists. Thane was far too smart to act openly. He was poisoning the well, turning Wolfe's own people against him, one malicious rumor at a time, creating an atmosphere of distrust and instability. Lily knew she couldn't use Wolfe's official channels of power. Sending his enforcers to interrogate servants would create widespread panic and would be a disastrous tactical mistake. It would prove Thane's point, that their rule was becoming tyrannical in a new, insidious way, replacing the old, honest brutality with the new, sneaky oppression. She had to fight these shadows with shadows of her own. She began to spend more and more time in the kitchens, helping the staff with small tasks, listening to their gossip, their complaints, their hopes. She learned which guards were grumbling about the new, less aggressive training regimens, which junior officers felt they had been passed over for promotion in favor of more diplomatic types, which of the old, noble families still held a deep-seated reverence for the memory of Wolfe's father. She wasn't a queen demanding information. She was just Lily, the Omega who understood their world, who remembered what it was like to be overlooked, sharing a cup of tea and listening to their worries. Her empathy was her greatest intelligence-gathering tool. Her most valuable and most unlikely ally in this silent war came from the heap of her discarded past. During the Cold War between her and Wolfe, he had unceremoniously dumped her entire wardrobe onto the closet floor. One evening, determined to finally clear the last remnant of that painful battle, she was sorting through the dresses. At the very bottom of the pile, tucked into the lining of an exquisitely embroidered clutch purse she had never used, her fingers brushed against something small, hard, and metallic. It was a tiny, wafer-thin encrypted communications device. It was a spy's tool, a piece of sophisticated technology far beyond what would normally be given to a mate. It had been planted in her wardrobe before she had even worn any of the clothes, a secret gift from an unknown party. Her heart pounded as she activated it. A single, preloaded message glowed on the tiny screen. "The enemy of my enemy is my friend. A useful tool should you ever need one. J. Javier, the charming, provocative alpha from the Sunstone Pack, the man who had triggered Wolfe's jealous rage at the gala."
He had seen the conflict between her and Wolfe, had sensed the prison within the gilded cage, and he had made his own strategic calculation. He hadn't just been flirting, he had been probing for a potential ally.
He had given her a secret line of communication, a weapon to use in her own private war, a back channel that bypassed Wolfe's entire intelligence network. She hesitated for a full day, the device feeling like a burning coal in her hand. The risks were immense. Communicating secretly with another Alpha, especially one who had so openly challenged Wolfe, could be construed as treason. If Wolfe found out, it could shatter the fragile trust they had so carefully built. But she was fighting for her life, for her future, and for the man she was coming to love. She needed objective information, a perspective from outside the biased, insular, and increasingly paranoid world of the Iron Claw Dominion. With a deep breath, she typed a single, simple message, her fingers trembling slightly. "Thane, what do you know?" The reply came within the hour, a testament to the efficiency of Javier's own intelligence network. An old wolf who dreams of a dead king, a dangerous romantic. He has been making quiet contact with other traditionalist factions in the northern packs, specifically the Stonefang and the Frostfall. He is trying to build a coalition to challenge Wolfe's new era of peace. He sees your prosperity fund not as a gift, but as a bribe to buy loyalty that should be commanded by fear. He is dangerous, Lily, more dangerous than you think. He is not just trying to discredit you. He is trying to isolate Wolfe and force a vote of no confidence at the next Great Council. He wants the throne. Javier's information was the crucial piece of the puzzle she had been missing. Thane wasn't just staging an internal protest. He was planning a full-blown coup using outside forces who were also unsettled by Wolfe's new, less predictable leadership. Armed with this devastating knowledge, Lily began her counter-offensive. She didn't go to Wolfe, not yet. This was her battle to fight. She needed to disarm the threat herself, to prove to herself and to him that she could stand on her own as a political power. She used Helga and her network of servants to spread new whispers, new truths. She made sure stories of the Prosperity Fund's success, of the Stonefang Pack's elders receiving a life-saving shipment of medicine, of the Frostfall Pack's children having full bellies for the first time in a generation, circulated among the lower ranks of the Dominion. She fought Thane's poison of fear with the potent antidote of hope and prosperity. She also used Javier's intel with surgical precision. Knowing which external factions Thane was courting, she began to craft a new series of diplomatic and trade proposals for Wolfe, never revealing her source. Her proposals were brilliant, offering economic incentives and mutual defense pacts to the Stonefang and Frostfall packs that were too good to refuse. She was cutting Thane off at the knees, using the tools of prosperity and diplomacy to dismantle his coalition of warmongers before it could even fully form.
Wolfe watched her, a storm of conflicting emotions in his eyes. He knew she was working on something. He could feel her intense focus, her quiet, fierce determination through the bond. The controlling part of him, the Alpha who needed to know everything, screamed at him to intervene, to demand answers. But the new part of him, the part that had seen her mind at work, the part that trusted her, held him back. He had promised her equality. He had called her his queen. Now he had to let her rule. His inaction, his forced patience, was the greatest and most difficult test of his transformation. The conspiracy of shadows was being fought by a queen who had learned to rule from within them. Lily, the Omega orphan, was proving to be a master of a new kind of warfare, a silent, subtle battle of information, empathy, and influence. Thane thought he was haunting the Dominion with the ghost of a dead king, but he was being systematically outmaneuvered by a living queen, and the final, inevitable confrontation was drawing ever closer. Chapter 18. The Alpha's Choice. The confrontation, when it finally came, was not in a shadowy corridor or on a bloody battlefield, but in the great council hall, a place of ancient tradition and immense power. Thane, seeing his external support systematically dismantled by Lily's brilliant, preemptive diplomacy, had been forced to make his move before he was completely isolated.
He had invoked an ancient right, one reserved for the most respected and senior members of the Dominion, to call a council of elders to formally challenge the direction of the Alpha Lord's rule. It was a direct, public challenge to their leadership, a move designed to force a crisis and rally the traditionalists to his side. The hall was packed, the atmosphere thick with a tension that was almost a physical presence. The elders, a dozen gray-muzzled, stern-faced wolves, sat on a raised platform, their expressions grim and unreadable. The floor was filled with the Dominion's most influential pack leaders, warriors, and nobles. Lily sat beside Wolfe on two thrones at the front, the very picture of a united king and queen. But she could feel the division in the room, the auras of conflicting loyalties, the crushing weight of a century of tradition pressing down on them. Thane stood alone in the center of the hall, his presence formidable. He was a warrior of the old school, his face a roadmap of old scars, his eyes burning with the righteous, fanatical light of a true believer. He began by addressing the elders, but his true target was the hearts and minds of the assembled wolves, and he did not look at Wolfe, he looked directly at Lily. For 100 years, the iron-clawed Dominion has been the greatest power on this continent. We built that power on a foundation of strength, of will, of absolute uncompromising force. We were a blade in a world of soft flesh. And now, he sneered, finally turning his accusing gaze on Wolfe. Our Alpha sharpens his wits on accounting ledgers and allows his judgment to be clouded, to be weakened by the whispers of an Omega.
A low, uneasy murmur went through the crowd. Thane was voicing the secret, unspoken fears of many in the room. He calls it a new era of peace, Thane continued, his voice dripping with scorn. I call it an era of weakness. He gives our hard-won wealth to our enemies, calling it diplomacy. He negotiates with our rivals when he should be crushing them, calling it strategy. He has taken the sword of his father, of his grandfather, the very symbol of our might, and has tried to beat it into a plowshare. And the cause of this rot, this decay in our strength, sits on the throne beside him. He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at Lily, his face contorted with righteous fury. She is the cause, this outsider, this weakness. She has poisoned our Alpha with soft ideas, with foolish compassion that has no place in the heart of a king. She is the ghost of his mother, a liability that will lead us all to ruin, just as his mother's weakness led to her death and the near collapse of this dominion. I call on you, elders. I call on you, warriors of the Iron Claw. Repudiate this soft, decadent path. Cast out the source of this poison. Let us return to the ways that made us strong. Let us be wolves again, not sheep led by a lamb. Thane's speech was a powerful, brutal masterstroke of rhetoric. It played on every deep-seated fear, every revered tradition, every painful scar in their collective history. He had painted Lily not just as an enemy, but as a historical curse, repeating itself. The hall was utterly silent, every eye now on Wolfe. This was the moment of truth, the fulcrum upon which the future would turn. He had to choose, not between Lily and Thane, but between the future and the past, between the man he was becoming and the ghost of the father he had spent his life trying to both emulate and escape. Lily's heart was in her throat, a frantic, trapped bird. She did not look at him. She kept her gaze fixed on the elders, her expression calm, serene, regal. She had done all she could. The final choice, the final battle, had to be his alone. Wolfe rose slowly from his throne. He did not look angry. He looked preternaturally calm, centered, as if a great internal storm that had raged for years had finally passed, leaving a core of unbreakable peace. He walked down from the dais until he stood in the center of the hall, just a few feet from Thane, his equal in the eyes of the council. You speak of my father, Wolfe began, his voice not a roar, but a deep, resonant calm that commanded more attention than any shout ever could. You speak of his strength, his will. Let me tell you about my father. My father was a great warrior. He was also a broken man. He ruled not through strength,
but through fear. And fear, Thane, is not a foundation. It is a fault line, waiting to crack and swallow everything whole. He turned his body slightly, addressing not just Thane, but the entire assembly. My father lost his mate, my mother, because he saw love as a weakness. He saw compassion as a fatal flaw. He taught me that a leader must be made of stone, that a heart is a liability a king cannot afford.
And for 15 years, I have tried to be that man. I have ruled with the fist because it was the only tool he ever gave me. He paused, and his stormy gaze found Lily's. In his eyes, she saw a look of profound love, of unwavering respect, of a gratitude so deep it was humbling. And then she came. She did not try to soften me. She challenged me. She did not offer me simple compassion. She offered me a different, more profound wisdom. She showed me that the warrior who only knows how to use a sword will eventually be defeated by the one who knows when not to draw it. He turned his gaze back to Thane, and now his eyes were filled with a cold, hard, pitying fire. You call her a weakness? This woman, with her mind, her courage, and her fierce, unyielding spirit, is stronger than any warrior in this hall. She defeated Alpha Alistair without a single warrior leaving his barracks. She is building us alliances based on loyalty and prosperity that will last for generations, long after alliances built on fear have crumbled to dust. She is not the ghost of my mother, Thane. She is the living, breathing future of this dominion. The power in his voice was absolute, undeniable. He was not just defending her. He was declaring his new creed, his new philosophy of rule. You speak of the old ways, Wolfe said, his voice dropping to a low, final verdict. The old ways led us to the brink of civil war under my father. The old ways cost him everything he ever loved. The old ways are dead. He looked directly at Thane, and there was a profound sadness in his eyes, the sadness of a man dismissing a part of his own history. My father was wrong, and so are you. He turned his back on Thane, a gesture of ultimate final dismissal, and walked back to the dais. He stood beside Lily, taking her hand in his, and raised it for all to see. She is not my mate, he declared, his voice ringing with power and pride through the silent hall. She is my queen, and her voice is my voice. Her will is my will. We rule this dominion together. Those who cannot accept that, those who wish to cling to the boasts of the past, have no place in our future. The choice is yours. The choice had been made. He had not just defended her. He had repudiated his father's entire legacy. He had chosen love over fear, wisdom over brute force. He had chosen their future over his painful past. In front of his entire dominion, he had finally, completely, and irrevocably chosen her. The conspiracy of shadows had been banished, not by a sword, but by the undeniable, brilliant light of the truth. Chapter 19. The Bond Perfected. The aftermath of the Great Council was swift and decisive. Thane's power base, built on the shifting sands of fear and nostalgia, crumbled under the weight of Wolfe's public, unequivocal declaration of a new age. Faced with a clear choice between a dead king's ghost and a living united monarchy that had already proven its strategic brilliance, the Dominion chose the future. Thane and his few remaining loyalists were not executed, an act that would have been a hallmark of his father's brutal reign. Instead, in a final, powerful demonstration of their new way, they were offered a choice: swear a new oath of fealty to their queen as well as their king, and be reintegrated into the pack with full honors, or accept a quiet, comfortable exile in the furthest, most isolated reaches of the Dominion. Most, seeing the tide had irrevocably turned, swore the new oath. Thane, his pride and his entire ideology shattered, chose exile, a broken, bitter relic of a bygone era, fading into obscurity.
With the last internal threat neutralized, a profound sense of peace, a true and deep quiet, settled over the penthouse for the first time since Lily's arrival. The constant political maneuvering, the threats from without and the poison from within had receded, leaving a quiet, intimate space for the two of them to finally, truly see each other. That evening they stood together on the balcony where he had once been haunted by his father's ghost. The city lights glittered below, a sea of 1,000,000 tiny stars, a peaceful kingdom at their feet. The glass tower was no longer a cage or a fortress, but simply home. "I was so afraid," Lily admitted, her voice a soft murmur in the cool night air, the words a confession of a fear she had not even allowed herself to feel during the council. "In the hall, when he was speaking, I was afraid you would choose him, that you would choose your father's way, that the weight of all that history would be too much." Wolfe turned to her, his large frame shielding her from the gentle breeze. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her jaw, his thumb stroking the soft skin of her cheek. The gesture, once so terrifyingly possessive, was now familiar, grounding, a silent language of love. "I was no choice to make, Lily. Not anymore. Thane was offering me a prison, the same one I have spent my entire life trying to escape. You offered me freedom." The beautiful irony of his words was not lost on her. He, her captor, had found his freedom in her, his prisoner. "And I spent so long being afraid of you," she whispered, her own confession, leaning into the warmth of his touch. "I was so terrified of being consumed, of disappearing into your world, of becoming nothing more than an extension of your will." "And I," he confessed, his stormy eyes filled with a raw, unguarded emotion that she had never seen before, a complete and total vulnerability. "I was afraid of you. I was terrified of what you made me feel from the very first moment the bond snapped into place. My father taught me that love was a fatal weakness, a poison that would rot a king from the inside out. I spent weeks trying to control you, to dominate you, to break you, because I was desperately trying to control the feelings you inspired in me. I thought if I could break your spirit, I could break your hold on mine. I was a fool, a blind, arrogant fool. Loving you was not my weakness, Lily. It has been the source of a strength I never knew I possessed. It is the strongest thing about me."
Her heart swelled, a painful, beautiful ache that filled her chest and made it hard to breathe. The words she had longed to hear, the words she had believed impossible for a man like him to ever say, were finally being spoken, freely and with absolute conviction. "I love you, Wolfe," she said, the words coming easily now, naturally, with no fear or reservation. She was not the fated mate of an alpha she was forced to accept. She was a woman who had seen the broken, lonely man behind the monster and had chosen to love him with her whole heart. "I know," he whispered, his forehead coming to rest against hers, their breaths mingling in the cool night air. "I felt it. Even when you were fighting me, even when you hated me with every fiber of your being, I could feel it through the bond, a tiny, stubborn, unyielding flame in the darkness. It was the only thing that gave me hope that my father was wrong." He pulled back slightly, his intense gaze searching hers, as if committing every detail of her face to memory. "I love you, Lily. Not because the goddess chose you for me, though I thank her for her wisdom every day. I love you for your courage, for your mind, for the fire in your soul that refused to be extinguished no matter what I threw at you. I love you because you did not just save my kingdom, you saved me from myself." The bond between them, once a conduit for pain, control, and anger, now flared to life with a new, breathtaking intensity. It was no longer a chain. It was a perfect, resonant chord of shared emotion, love, trust, respect, and a deep, soul-shattering sense of belonging. The jagged, broken pieces of their individual souls, forged in the lonely fires of trauma and mistrust, finally clicked into place, creating a whole that was infinitely stronger and more beautiful than the sum of its parts. He lowered his head, and this time there was no claiming, no possession, no assertion of dominance. His lips met hers in a kiss that was a question, a promise,
and a prayer all at once. It was a kiss of equals, of partners, of two souls who had fought their way through a private hell to find their heaven in each other. She melted against him, her arms wrapping around his strong neck, pulling him closer, her body a willing answer to his silent question. The kiss deepened, becoming a fiery, passionate expression of all the unspoken words, all the battles fought and won, all the pain and fear they had overcome. It was a celebration of their survival, a consummation of a love that had been forged not by the easy path of fate, but by the difficult, treacherous, and ultimately triumphant path of choice. Later, in the vast, opulent bedroom that had once been her prison cell, they came together not as Alpha and Omega, not as king and mate, but simply as a man and a woman who had finally, truly found their other half. The physical act was an extension of their emotional surrender, a perfect, searing union of two bodies and two souls. It was a conversation spoken in a language of touch and breath, a healing of old wounds, a sacred final sealing of their partnership. The scars on her neck and on his heart were no longer marks of pain, but testaments to the incredible, arduous journey they had taken to arrive in this moment of perfect peace. As they lay tangled together in the aftermath, the city lights a soft, distant glow through the glass wall. Lily traced the intricate lines of the tattoo on his forearm. She felt a profound sense of peace settle deep into her bones, a feeling of being completely, utterly safe for the very first time in her life. The glass tower doesn't feel like a cage anymore, she whispered into the quiet darkness. Wolfe tightens his arm around her, pulling her impossibly closer, as if he could absorb her into himself. That's because it's not, he murmured against her hair, his voice thick with sleep and contentment. It's our home, the foundation of the kingdom we will build together. The bond was finally perfected, not a shackle of fate, but a covenant of love, freely chosen and fiercely, beautifully won. Chapter 20. The Coronation. To solidify their new reality to the world, to make their partnership not just a political fact, but a sacred public institution, Wolfe planned a coronation. This was not to be a mere presentation of his mate, a centuries-old tradition where the alpha showed off his new possession. This was to be the formal, sacred crowning of a queen, an event the Ironclaw Dominion had not seen in over a century. It was a public declaration that their leadership was a diarchy, a rule of two, equal and united in the eyes of the goddess and their people. The ceremony was held in the Great Council Hall, the very same room where Thane had made his final, futile stand. The space, once a symbol of her trial and his agonizing choice, was now to be the stage for their collective triumph. It was filled to capacity, not just with the wolves of the Ironclaw Dominion, but with delegations from all the allied territories, including the now loyal and prosperous Northern Pax. Lily stood in an antechamber, her heart a steady, calm rhythm in her chest. The frantic, terrified bird that had hammered against her ribs was gone, replaced by a quiet, powerful strength. She was dressed in a gown of shimmering silver, the color of moonlight, a stark and deliberate contrast to the emerald green dress of conquest she had worn at the fateful gala. This gown was elegant, powerful, and regal. The intricate silver scar on her neck was not covered by makeup or jewels, but was left visible, a symbol not of her subjugation, but of her survival, her strength, and the unique, arduous journey they had taken together. The heavy oak doors of the hall swung open. Wolfe stood waiting for her at the entrance. He was dressed in the formal, ancestral regalia of the Ironclaw Alpha Lords, all black and silver, looking every inch the formidable king he was. But the look in his eyes when he saw her was not that of a king looking at his property. It was the look of a man gazing upon his entire world, his equal, his partner. He held out his hand, and she took it without hesitation, their fingers lacing together in a familiar, comforting grip. Together, they walked down the long aisle, a united front. The hall was silent, every eye upon them. Lily's gaze swept the crowd, and the faces she saw were a living tapestry of her past and future, She saw the elders, including a stoic, unsmiling Marcus, their faces filled with a deep, hard-won respect. She saw the minor alphas from the Prosperity Fund, their expressions filled with a genuine gratitude and unwavering loyalty. She saw Javier from the Sunstone Pack, who caught her eye and gave her a small, genuine smile and a respectful dip of his head. He had come not as a rival, but as a true ally, an acknowledgement of the new power she wielded. And near the back, in a position of enforced humility but not overt shame, stood the Bennett family. Lord and Lady Bennett looked pale and diminished, their faces a mixture of shock and profound, bitter regret at their spectacular miscalculation. Bryony looked as though she had swallowed poison, her beautiful face twisted with an envy so raw it was almost pitiable. They were a necessary reminder of how far she had come, from an overlooked orphan to a queen. But the only face that truly mattered to her was in the front row, in a place of highest honor. Chloe sat there, her fiery red hair a beacon in the crowd, her face streaked with tears of pure, unadulterated joy for her friend. Their eyes met across the distance, and in that single, silent look, a lifetime of friendship, loyalty, and shared hope was communicated. Lillian Wolfe ascended the dais. The elder, Alistair, the same ancient wolf who had presided over the fateful, disastrous choosing, stood holding a simple but beautiful crown of woven silver entwined with white mountain blossoms. He began the ancient rites, but the words he spoke were new, rewritten by Lily and Wolfe to reflect their new era. "We are not here today to witness a bond of fate," he declared, his voice ringing with a conviction that reached every corner of the hall. "We are here to celebrate a partnership of choice, a leadership forged not in dominance, but in respect, a strength born not of one, but of two." Wolfe took the crown from the elder. He turned to Lily, his stormy eyes soft with an emotion so profound it made her breath catch in her throat. "I claimed you with my teeth," he murmured, his voice for her ears alone, a final public confession and an apology. "Now I crown you with my heart, my soul, and my unwavering respect." He gently placed the crown upon her head. It was not heavy. It felt right, as if it had been waiting for her, as if she had been born to wear it. He stepped back, and Lily turned to face the people, her people. She raised her head, the silver crown glinting in the light, her gaze sweeping over the silent, watchful assembly. She had started this journey as a terrified Omega hiding in the shadows. Now she stood in the full, brilliant light, a queen in her own right. "I stand before you not as a ruler who is above you, but as a leader who will stand with you. Together, we will build a future not on the foundations of fear that crumble, but on the pillars of prosperity, loyalty, and justice that endure. The iron-clawed dominion will be a shield for the weak and a beacon of true strength, a kingdom we can all be proud to call home." For a moment, there was a stunned, profound silence as the full weight of her words, of this new reality, settled over them. Then a single person began to clap. It was Chloe. Her applause, loud in the silence, was quickly joined by another and another, until the entire hall erupted in a thunderous, roaring ovation that shook the very foundations of the ancient hall. It wasn't just polite, ceremonial applause. It was a roar of genuine approval, of hope, of unwavering loyalty to their new queen. Wolfe came to stand beside her, his hand finding hers and gripping it tightly. He did not speak, but she could feel his pride, his love, his unwavering support through their perfected bond. They had faced down their personal and political ghosts. They had reshaped their world. And now they stood on the precipice of a new beginning together. Chapter 21. The Kingdom We Build. The day after the coronation, Lily stood on the balcony of the penthouse, the cool mountain air crisp against her skin. The city glittered below, a testament to the prosperity and peace that had settled over the Dominion. The glass tower was no longer a prison or a fortress. It was a watchtower, the heart of a thriving, evolving kingdom. She was not reflecting on a year of success, but on the immense, beautiful, and daunting task that lay ahead and her absolute readiness to face it. The balcony doors slid open, and Wolfe stepped out, wrapping his strong arms around her from behind. He rested his chin on her shoulder, his familiar warmth seeping into her, a safe harbor in the vast world. "The real work begins now, my queen," he murmured, his lips brushing against the scar on her neck. She smiled, leaning back against his solid, comforting chest. The scar, once a brand of shame and subjugation, was now just a part of their story. It was a reminder of the brutal, painful beginning that had, against all odds, led to their beautiful present. "Our work," she corrected softly. "Always," he agreed, his voice a contented rumble. They stood in comfortable silence for a long time, watching the endless dance of lights below. Their life would be one of immense pressure and responsibility, of constant challenges and difficult decisions. But in moments like this, they were not a king and queen weighed down by crowns. They were just Wolfe and Lily, a man and a woman who had fought their way through a private, bitter war to find a profound and lasting peace in each other. "Do you ever miss the quiet?" he asked, his voice a low vibration against her back. Lily thought for a moment, remembering the small attic room, the quiet solitude, the simple, predictable pain of being a nobody. "Sometimes," she admitted with a surprising honesty, "I miss the girl who believed her only ambition was to go unnoticed. But I know now that what she really craved wasn't invisibility, it was safety. And I have never, in my entire life, felt safer or more seen than I do right now, in this moment, with you."
He tightened his arms around her, a fierce, protective gesture that was now born of love, not possession. "My father taught me that power was the only real shield in this world," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "He was wrong. Love is. Loving you, trusting you, that is the only armor I have ever needed. You are my strength, Lily. You always were." The bond between them pulsed with a quiet, steady, and profound contentment. It was a perfect harmony, a song of two souls finally completely in tune. The journey had been a crucible, a trial by fire that had burned away their old fears, their crippling pride, and their profound loneliness, leaving behind something pure, resilient, and everlasting. He had been the merciless Alpha Lord, a king ruling a kingdom built on the brittle foundations of fear. She had been the Omega orphan, a prisoner in a gilded cage who dreamed only of freedom. But together, they had built something new, a partnership, a legacy, a love story written not in the stars by a fickle goddess, but in the hard-won, deliberate choices of their own hearts. As they stood together, looking out over the peaceful, prosperous land they now ruled as one, they were no longer bound by a merciless fate. They were bound only by a love that had proven to be the most powerful, transformative, and triumphant force of all. Kalen appeared at the open balcony door, his presence quiet and respectful. He bowed his head. "My lord, my queen, a message from the Frostfall Pack. Their Alpha sends his gratitude for their leaf convoy. He says it arrived just as their winter stores were failing. He also reports a rogue pack has been raiding their southern border and asks for counsel." The old wolf would have seen this as a test of dominance. He would have sent warriors, solved the problem with force, and put the Frostfall Alpha in his debt. Lily felt a flicker of that old instinct from him through the bond, a shadow of the man he used to be. But it was just a shadow. He didn't move. He simply looked at her, a silent question in his eyes. "What is our move?" Lily stepped forward, away from the warmth of his embrace and into the cool air of her authority. "Kalen," she said, her voice calm and decisive, "send a message back. Tell the Frostfall Alpha that the Ironclad Dominion does not offer counsel from afar. We offer partnership.
A detachment of our best trackers will be there within 2 days, not to fight their battle for them, but to assist their warriors in securing their own border. And include a trade proposal. Offer to fund a new watchtower on that border in exchange for first rights on their spring timber harvest. Turn their crisis into our mutual opportunity. Kalen's eyes lit with admiration. He bowed deeply. At once, my queen. As he left, Wolf stepped up behind her again, his arms encircling her waist. He nuzzled his face into her hair, his deep chuckle a warm vibration against her skin. Turn their crisis into our mutual opportunity, he repeated, his voice full of wonder and pride. You see battlefields no one else does. I learned from a very good, if reluctant teacher, she said, tilting her head back to look at him, a playful smile on her lips.
He met her smile, his stormy eyes soft and full of a love so deep it still stole her breath away. The work was just beginning. There would be more challenges, more shadows to fight, more kingdoms to build. But for the first time, the future was not a terrifying unknown. It was a promise they would face together, not as a merciless lord and his captive mate, but as a king and queen, united and unbeatable, forging a new legacy, one wise and compassionate choice at a time. I just want to say a very big thank you for the love and support, and I wouldn't be here doing what I love if it weren't for you. Daily, we keep on improving and getting better to tell you the best stories and to help you relax and enter into a beautiful werewolf romance world. Please let me know your thoughts and don't forget to subscribe. The next video is already in production, and trust me, it is amazing. We've decided to give us girls a chance to rule, and let's see what we can do. A female alpha, a female heroine, but let's also see if she can navigate love in her leadership role.